The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the narrow trail that wound through the woods. I had been hiking for most of the day, pushing my limits a little too much as I tried to finish the section before dark. The trees seemed to be closing in on me, their trunks towering high above, their thick canopies barely letting any light filter through. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp leaves and pine needles. There wasn't much of a breeze, and the temperature was beginning to drop. I had been on the trail for hours, my legs aching from the long climb and the uneven terrain. My pack was starting to feel heavier, but I couldn't bring myself to stop just yet. I wasn't particularly in a rush, but the thought of camping alone in the woods as night settled in didn't sit well with me. I kept glancing at my watch, calculating the amount of time I had before the light would be completely gone. Maybe I could find a good spot before it got too dark, set up camp quickly, and cook something warm. Then, just as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another tree, an odd shape that caught my eye. But as I focused, I realized it was a person, a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the line of trees. I couldn't see much detail at that distance, but I could make out the shape of a person standing perfectly still. My heart skipped a beat, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. It wasn't just the presence of someone else in the woods. Something about the way they stood, unmoving and silent, unsettled me. I called out, trying to gauge if it was another hiker. "Hey, you there?" The figure didn't respond. There was no movement, no acknowledgement that it had heard me. I squinted, trying to make out more details. It looked like it was wearing a dark jacket or coat, but it was hard to say for sure. The woods around it were dense, the shadows making everything look much darker than it should have been. My instincts told me something was off, but I couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was just my fatigue playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just some weird illusion from the dimming light. But there was a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, a deep unease that I couldn't shake. I should have turned back then, should have just gone the other way and avoided whatever this was. But for some reason, I didn't. I took a few cautious steps forward, my boots crunching on the dried leaves and twigs beneath me. Still, the figure didn't move. It didn't even look in my direction. My heart pounded a little faster. Something about it was strange, too still, too quiet. It wasn't normal to just stand there like that, not in a place like this. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up even more, a chill crawling up my spine. I called out again, louder this time. "Hey, are you okay?" But nothing, not even a sound. No rustling in the trees. No response at all. I took another step, then another. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but at that moment, my mind wasn't making sense of it. The closer I got, the more I realized just how wrong it felt. There was a deep silence surrounding that spot in the woods, a silence that felt almost unnatural, as if the forest itself had gone still and quiet to watch. When I reached what I felt was the closest I could get, about 20 feet away, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The figure, it was gone. I blinked, trying to process what I was seeing. One moment, it had been standing there, tall and unmoving, and the next, it was simply gone, like it had melted into the shadows. No movement, no rustling, no sound at all. Just gone. I stood there frozen, my pulse racing in my ears. My mind was spinning, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe it had just stepped back into the trees. Maybe it was someone I couldn't see clearly because of the light. But no, that didn't make sense. I would have heard movement, even if it was subtle. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the spot where the figure had been. I waited for a long moment, scanning the trees, the shadows, the underbrush. But nothing moved. There was no sound, no sign of anyone else. The silence felt too thick, too oppressive. My feet felt rooted to the ground, as though the earth beneath me had frozen me in place. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I don't know what compelled me to take another step toward where the figure had stood. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that I needed to be sure, that I needed to understand what had just happened. But as I stepped forward, I noticed something else. The air around me felt colder. A strange chill ran through my body, even though I could tell the temperature hadn't dropped that much. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep moving, despite every instinct telling me to turn and run. I took another few steps, Then I saw it, a movement just at the edge of my vision, something shifting in the shadows. My heart jumped in my chest, and I spun around, instinctively reaching for my flashlight, my fingers trembling as I turned it on. I shone the light across the forest floor, over the trees, through the underbrush, but there was nothing. I could feel my breath coming faster now, panic starting to rise in my chest. There was something out there. I wasn't imagining it. The air felt too heavy. I wasn't alone. I was sure of it now. Someone or something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled again, and I spun around once more, my heart thumping painfully in my chest. But the figure, whatever it had been, was still gone. I couldn't stand it anymore. The fear, the uncertainty, the feeling of being watched. It was overwhelming. My body moved before my brain could fully process the decision. I turned around, my boots crunching loudly on the trail as I started walking faster, then faster still. It didn't matter where I was going. I just had to get out of there. The trail behind me was a blur as I rushed to put distance between myself and whatever had been in those woods. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. I kept walking, pushing myself harder, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The farther I went, the more I could hear the sounds of the forest again. The chirp of crickets, the rustling of leaves, the occasional distant bird call. But it wasn't enough to calm me. My eyes darted from side to side, my senses heightened as I listened for anything that might suggest I wasn't alone. The forest was too quiet, and it felt too big, too endless. Eventually, the trail began to open up, and I saw the faint outline of a clearing ahead. It wasn't much, just a break in the trees, but it was enough. A small comfort, a place where I could finally stop, catch my breath, and process everything that had just happened. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the clearing, where I sank to my knees, panting, shaking with a combination of fear and exhaustion. I wasn't sure how long I sat there. I didn't care. The trail felt far behind me, and I was far enough away from whatever had been back there. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that I had just imagined it. Maybe it was some odd trick of the light, or maybe I'd just been so tired that my brain had started playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There had been something there, something I couldn't explain. And as I sat in the clearing, listening to the sounds of the forest slowly coming back to life, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was had followed me. That was still out there, waiting, watching. I set out for my hike that morning with a full pack, expecting a long day on the trail. The sun was barely up, and the forest around me was still damp with the morning dew. I hadn't been on this trail in a while, but it was familiar enough. The same trees, the same winding path, the same quiet solitude I craved. I was well into the hike by the time the sun started peeking through the canopy above, casting long, crooked shadows across the trail. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and the faint, sharp scent of wet moss. The only sound around me was the crunch of my boots on the dry, fallen leaves, and the occasional rustle from the bushes as small creatures moved around. It was peaceful, perfect even, the kind of silence that let your thoughts wander. After about an hour of hiking, I came to a part of the trail that started sloping downwards, following a small creek that had carved a path through the forest. The sound of water trickling over rocks was a welcome change from the monotonous rustle of leaves. I paused for a moment, taking in the view, a small waterfall tumbling down a set of rocks just ahead, sunlight glinting off the surface of the water in bright patches. I stood there for a few minutes, lost in the moment, until I heard something. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but then it became more distinct. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just a part of the forest. Animals often move around in the underbrush, and sometimes it feels like footsteps when it's just the wind stirring the leaves. But this was different. The steps were too rhythmic, too human. I couldn't place the sound, definitely not an animal, and it didn't sound like anyone else was on the trail. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The path behind me was empty, the trees stretching in a quiet, undisturbed line. I told myself I was just hearing things and shook it off, turning back to the trail ahead. As I resumed walking, the sound of the footsteps continued. It wasn't close enough to be right behind me, but it was there, keeping a steady pace, always just behind. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as I continued, I realized it wasn't stopping. I picked up my pace a little, and to my growing confusion, the footsteps picked up as well, matching my speed exactly. If I slowed down, they slowed down too. If I sped up, they followed suit. I stopped in my tracks, my heart starting to beat faster. I turned around sharply, scanning the trail. There was nothing, just the usual path, trees, ferns, rocks. I felt stupid for getting worked up, but the sound of the steps still lingered in my ears. The forest was too still, too quiet now. There was nothing to explain the sensation of someone walking just behind me, as though they were mirroring my every move. I forced myself to breathe deeply, trying to calm the unease crawling up my spine. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an animal, maybe just the echo of my own steps in the empty forest. But I knew it wasn't just that. It wasn't an echo. It was too deliberate, too close. I shook my head and kept walking, trying to put it out of my mind. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were still there, still matching my pace. I glanced behind me again, a little more urgently this time, but again, there was nothing. The trail was as empty as it had been when I first looked. Still, the sound of steps kept ringing in my ears, too precise, too calculated. The longer I walked, the more the feeling of being followed grew. I couldn't shake the idea that something was just behind me, that I wasn't alone on this trail anymore. I pushed my pace again, my breath starting to quicken. The footsteps followed. The rhythm was the same, never rushing, never faltering, always right there. I paused at a bend in the trail, and for the first time, I really listened. The footsteps stopped too. The silence was so complete, it was almost suffocating. I waited for a moment, straining to hear anything that might explain what was happening. Nothing, not a sound. No animals, no rustling in the trees. Just the quiet hum of the forest, the kind of quiet that feels too thick, too heavy. I turned around again. This time, I stood there for a full minute, scanning every inch of the trail behind me. The woods were dense, the trees tall and packed tightly together, their trunks thick and dark. But there was nothing, not even a hint of movement. It was just a trail, empty. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe I was starting to get paranoid. But something didn't sit right. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it, the weight of being watched, of being followed. I turned back to face forward and took a few steps. Then I froze again. The footsteps were back. Not in my head, not an echo of my own, but distinct, real, and following me step by step. I didn't dare turn around this time. I kept walking, faster now, heart pounding, adrenaline started to pump. I could feel my legs getting tired from the faster pace, my breath growing more ragged with each step, but the footsteps stayed with me. It was a game now. The more I walked, the more the steps followed. It didn't matter how fast I went. The shadow was always right behind me, never speeding up, never slowing down. I had to get away. I had to leave this place. I rounded a corner in the trail, hoping to lose whatever it was behind me. But when I glanced back, there was nothing. For the first time since it all started, I felt a moment of relief. No footsteps, no shadow. I stopped dead in my tracks, my body sagging with exhaustion and fear. I was shaking now, the tension in my body too much to keep up with. The trail was empty. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the panic finally start to fade. There was no one there. It was just me and the forest. I wasn't being followed. I wasn't being watched. My mind was playing tricks on me, that was all. I stood still for a moment longer, letting my heart rate slow, trying to gather myself. I looked back once more, just to reassure myself, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the trail, barely visible between the trees, was a man standing still, his figure half hidden in the shadow of the trees. I froze. He wasn't looking at me. His head was tilted down like he was studying the ground, but I could see enough to know that he was real. I didn't know how long he'd been there, standing just out of sight. He hadn't made a sound. He hadn't moved a muscle. My heart raced again, faster this time, pounding in my chest. I stood there for a moment, not knowing what to do, caught between the need to run and the instinct to stay still. Then, slowly, the figure straightened up. He didn't move toward me, but he didn't walk away either. He just stood there, his back to the trees, as if waiting for something. Waiting for me. I took a deep breath, my mind scrambling for a solution. I had to get out of here, but I didn't want to turn my back on him, not knowing what he might do. Every part of me screamed to run, but I couldn't make myself move. I couldn't take my eyes off of him. For a long, painful moment, I just stood there, staring, unsure of whether I was in danger or if I was just letting my mind get the best of me. And then, as slowly as he had appeared, the man turned around. He didn't look back. He didn't do anything dramatic. He just turned and started walking deeper into the woods, disappearing behind the trees. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I dared to take a step. Slowly, carefully, I turned back to the trail and kept walking. The footsteps were gone now. The feeling of being watched was gone. The man was gone. I didn't know who he was or why he had been there, but I didn't care. I was alone again. I walked the rest of the trail in silence, my pace steady but cautious, and I didn't look back again. I don't know if the man had been following me all along, or if I had simply been mistaken about what I was hearing. Maybe it was just the woods playing tricks on me, but when I reached the end of the trail, I didn't feel any of the peace I had before. The hike that had once seemed like the perfect escape now felt like a reminder of how quickly things could turn unsettling. I never went back to that trail, never even thought about it again, and I definitely never went hiking alone after that. I was out in the woods that afternoon, hunting alone like I usually did when the weather was right. The trees stood tall and thick, and the smell of fresh pine filled the air. It was one of those crisp autumn days where the sun barely pierced through the canopy, and everything was damp from the morning mist. I was used to this, used to the solitude, the quiet, and the feeling of being part of nature. It was my escape. The world seemed to slow down when I was out there, as if the pressures of life and work could be forgotten for a while. I had my rifle slung over my shoulder, my boots crunching softly on the leaves as I moved through the underbrush. I was making my way toward an area I had marked on my map, an old hunting ground where I had always had good luck in the past. The plan was to get there, settle in, and wait. I didn't have high expectations. It wasn't about getting a kill today. It was about being in the woods, feeling the calm and the rhythm of the hunt. But something fell off. At first, it was subtle, a slight tension in the air. The wind shifted direction, sending a chill up my spine. I paused for a moment, instinctively scanning my surroundings. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the calls of distant birds, seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was watching me. It wasn't an immediate threat, more like a presence just out of sight, just beyond my reach. I checked the area around me, looking into the dense thicket of trees, peering through the thick trunks and shadows. There was nothing, just the silence of the woods. My rifle felt heavier in my hand, a subtle weight that made me more aware of its presence. I shook my head, trying to push the feeling down. It was nothing. The woods could play tricks on you sometimes, make you think you were being watched, when really it was just the quiet making your mind jump to conclusions. Still, I couldn't ignore the sense that something wasn't right. I kept moving, trying to brush it off. But every few steps, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the edges of my vision, trying to catch sight of whatever it was that had me on edge. Then it happened. A twig snapped. The sound was sharp, distinct, and close. Too close. My heart skipped a beat. It was the kind of sound you didn't hear by accident in the woods. Something had stepped on it. Something heavy, something moving deliberately. I froze. I waited, but the woods were still. No movement, no sound. Just the rustling of the wind in the trees. I held my breath, trying to listen for anything that might confirm what I just heard. My fingers tightened around the rifle, and I took a slow, careful step back, trying to position myself where I could see more of the surrounding area. Nothing. No movement. No shadow. I couldn't even hear the wind through the trees anymore. It was that quiet. I turned around slowly, scanning every direction. Still, I saw nothing. Was it just my imagination? Was it the wind? I didn't think so. The sound had been too clear, too precise. Then it came again. Another twig snap. Closer this time. I didn't hesitate. I spun around, my rifle raised, expecting to see something or someone standing there. But the space behind me was empty. No one. Nothing. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I stood there, straining my ears, trying to hear something, anything that would explain what was happening. But there was nothing. I took a few more steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, moving through the woods, always just out of view. My instincts were telling me to leave, to get out of there, but I was stubborn. I didn't want to run. That's not what hunters did. We faced whatever came, whether it was an animal or another hunter. But then the air changed. It grew colder. Not the kind of cold that comes with a chill in the air, but the kind of cold that made you feel like something was watching you, waiting. The trees around me seemed to close in, and the forest felt more oppressive, as if it were pressing in on me. I turned again, checking the path behind me. It was still clear, still empty. I could feel my pulse quickening now, my breathing a little more erratic. I had to get a grip. This wasn't the first time I'd hunted in these woods, and it sure as hell wasn't the first time I'd been alone in the wild. I had to shake off whatever was creeping into my head. Maybe it was just the isolation or the stillness that made everything feel wrong. But then, the snap of a branch came again. This time it was closer, so close that I could almost hear the weight of it, of something, someone, moving quietly through the forest. I couldn't see them, but I knew something was there. Something was watching me. My eyes darted around, checking every shadow, every movement in the trees. I could hear my breath now, sharp and quick in my ears. My rifle felt heavier than before, and I was starting to second-guess my decision to stay. That's when the footsteps started. They were slow at first, almost tentative, but they were unmistakable. A person was walking through the woods behind me, trying to stay quiet, but not succeeding. Each step was deliberate, but the sound of boots on the forest floor was clear. The panic hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't alone. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to reason. I turned and bolted. I ran faster than I thought I could, my boots thundering against the forest floor, the trees flashing by in a blur. I wasn't looking back. I couldn't. I just focused on getting to my car, the only safe place I knew. I didn't care if it was just some other hunter or someone else out there. The woods weren't supposed to be like this. The woods were supposed to be calm, peaceful, my escape from everything else. But now they felt wrong, like a trap. As I ran, I could hear the footsteps behind me, closer now. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide anymore. They were coming for me. I stumbled over a tree root, my hands scraping against the rough bark as I tried to catch myself. The panic surged through me, clouding my mind. I couldn't let myself fall. I couldn't let myself be caught. I had to get to the car. The path seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around me, blocking out the light. I kept running, faster now, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. I wasn't looking back. I couldn't afford to. My only focus was the parking lot where I had left my car. I reached the edge of the woods and saw the break in the trees ahead. The small dirt road that led to the parking lot was visible in the distance, a slice of familiarity in the middle of all this madness. But the footsteps were still there, still behind me. I could see my car now, just a few yards away. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted toward it, desperate to make it. The door was only a few steps away when I heard the sound of a twig snapping behind me again. This time it was right at my back. I didn't turn around. I threw open the door, jumped into the seat, and slammed it shut, locking the door with trembling hands. I didn't look back at the woods. I sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath. I was shaking, my heart still racing, and the feeling of being watched lingered. But there was nothing behind me now. No footsteps, no twig snapping. Just the hum of the engine and the slow return to calm. I started the car and pulled away, not looking back once. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out behind me. I didn't go back to the woods after that day. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there, that whatever had been following me hadn't left. But I also knew that whatever it was, it had gotten what it wanted. It had made its presence known. And for me, that was enough. I wasn't about to find out what came next. I've been looking forward to this weekend for months. A small, remote cabin in the woods, all to myself, with nothing to do except relax, get away from work, and disconnect from the world. No phone signal, no internet, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. The cabin was secluded, the kind of place you could only reach by winding down narrow dirt roads, surrounded by nothing but the thick forest. The kind of place where you could leave everything behind and just exist. I arrived Friday afternoon, after a long drive that took me through little towns and then to the end of a narrow gravel road that led me to the cabin. It looked exactly like I'd imagined. A small wooden structure, set back against the trees, with a porch and a large stone fireplace. There was a worn-out rocking chair on the porch and a large window that looked out over the forest. I could already feel the peacefulness of the place wrapping around me. After unloading my bags and making myself at home, I spent the rest of the day exploring the area, taking in the fresh air, and taking some pictures of the scenery. By the time the sun started to set, I was ready to settle in for the night. I made myself some dinner in the small, rustic kitchen, then sat by the fire for a while, reading a book I had brought along. As the night deepened, I noticed how still everything was. No noise, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. It was the kind of silence that presses against you, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only one left in the world. I stayed up late, not wanting to waste the peace, but eventually I felt my eyes growing heavy. I put the book down, dimmed the lights, and went to bed. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and as I pulled the thick, warm blankets over me, I drifted off to sleep. It was a little after midnight when I was awakened by a noise. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the wood creaking under the weight of the night. But then it came again, louder this time. Footsteps. At first, I thought maybe it was just an animal outside, maybe a deer or some other creature walking around the cabin. But the footsteps sounded too heavy for that, too deliberate, like someone walking above me. My heart started to race. The cabin was small, and there was no second floor, no attic. The idea of someone being up there didn't make sense. I lay there, frozen, listening intently. The footsteps continued, slow and heavy. They moved across the floor above me, each step echoing through the silence. And then I heard something else. Breathing. Deep, labored breathing, like someone was struggling to catch their breath. The kind of breathing that doesn't belong in a quiet, isolated cabin in the woods. I lay there for what felt like hours, too scared to move, too afraid to make a sound. The footsteps continued, followed by the occasional sound of heavy, uneven breaths. It was impossible to ignore now. There was someone or something in the cabin. I was suddenly wide awake, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself that I was just hearing things, that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I wasn't alone in the cabin. The idea of sitting there and doing nothing was unbearable. I grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table, my hands shaking as I flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I didn't want to move. What if it was someone? What if they were still there, listening to me, waiting for me to make a sound? The breathing continued, and the footsteps moved again, now closer to the door that separated the living room from the bedroom. I didn't know what to do. I knew I couldn't just stay there. I gathered every ounce of courage and quietly slipped out of bed, moving as silently as I could across the room. I shined a flashlight toward the door, trying to peer out into the dark living area, but everything seemed still. Too still. I waited for what felt like forever, my ears straining for any sound. But all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. I finally moved toward the door, each step feeling like it took an eternity. I opened the door slowly, trying not to make a sound. The living room was empty. The cabin was still, but my heart didn't slow down. I could still hear the footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, like they were just out of reach, waiting for me to turn around. I shone the light up toward the ceiling, but there was nothing. No sign of movement. Just silence. I checked the kitchen. I checked the bathroom. Every corner of the cabin was empty. No one was there. No sign of anyone having entered the cabin. No sign of any disturbance. I stood in the middle of the living room, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were still there, moving, slow, and deliberate, just above me. I couldn't explain it. There was no way someone was up there. No way someone had gotten in. I went back to the bedroom, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I looked up at the ceiling again, trying to see something, anything, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone being there. The house was as it should have been. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my head spinning. I was starting to doubt myself. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was just my imagination. I told myself that over and over, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But the footsteps didn't stop. The breathing, too, continued. Heavy, uneven. It was like someone was right above me, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my jacket and the flashlight and hurried to the door. I threw it open, the cold air biting in my face as I stepped outside. The forest was silent. Nothing moved. It was just me, standing on the porch, staring into the darkness. I felt like I was losing my mind. The cabin had to be empty. There was no way I had heard what I thought I'd heard. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been in the cabin with me. I stood there for a long time, trying to gather my thoughts, but the footsteps didn't stop. They kept moving above me, getting louder, as though whatever it was moving closer. I decided to go back inside, but this time I locked the door behind me. I sat in a chair, keeping the flashlight trained on every corner of the room, every shadow. The breathing didn't stop. It was still there, still heavy, still just out of sight. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in that chair, staring at the door, the walls, the shadows. The sounds continued until the sun began to rise. By morning, the footsteps had stopped. The breathing was gone. Everything was still again. I didn't stay another night. I packed up my things, drove down the narrow gravel road, and didn't look back. I don't know what I heard that night, or who, or what was in that cabin with me, but I know one thing for sure. I never want to go back to that place again. I was out there alone, a few miles into the hike, the trail winding through the dense forest, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in spots, casting a flickering glow on the ground. My boots crunched on the loose gravel, the quiet solitude wrapping itself around me like a familiar cloak. This was one of my favorite hikes, a long stretch that led up into the mountains, with the promise of sweeping views from the top. But today, there was something different in the air, something that made my skin tingle, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was a late afternoon, and the air felt thick, as if the clouds were pressing down on everything. I had been hiking for about an hour and a half when I first heard it. The whisper, it wasn't loud, not at first, just a soft murmur, like a breeze catching the edges of something almost forgotten. It didn't make sense at first. I slowed my pace, looking around, but the trees stood tall, their trunks spaced far enough apart that nothing could be hiding between them. The trail was clear ahead. No animals, no people, just the sound of the wind swaying the branches. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, I'd hiked this trail plenty of times. It was safe, it was familiar. I just needed to focus. I took a deep breath and kept moving. The whisper came again, this time more distinct. It was faint, but definitely there. I couldn't understand the words. There was something strange about the tone, like it wasn't meant for me to hear. A chill ran down my spine. I stopped and stood still, my boots rooted to the earth. The wind wasn't strong, but it carried with it that same strange murmur. It was almost like it was surrounding me, floating through the air in an eerie dance. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. It's just the wind, I muttered to myself. Just the wind. But even as I said the words, something didn't feel right. I felt like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I had been alone on these trails before, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional bird. This was different. There was a presence in the air, one I couldn't see but felt, like something was waiting just beyond my sight. I kept walking, tried to ignore the growing unease building up inside me. But then the whisper came again, louder this time, closer. It was impossible to tell which direction it was coming from, but I could hear it clearly now, some kind of language, not one I recognized, soft but unmistakable. My heart thudded in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cutting through the quiet of the woods. My words seemed to disappear into the trees, swallowed by the vastness. There was no answer, only the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I scanned the trail, the forest beyond it. Nothing, no movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sensation of eyes tracking me from the shadows. I told myself again to calm down, that it was just my mind playing tricks, but the whispers grew louder. They weren't clear enough to make sense of, but they were no longer distant. They felt close, surrounding me like a cold breath on my neck. My pulse quickened, and I started walking faster, my pace quickening to a near jog. The wind picked up, and with it, the whispers seemed to grow stronger, more insistent, as if they were calling to me. I pushed through the thickening trees, the trail becoming steeper, the rocks beneath my feet slipping as I rushed forward. I wanted to get back to the trailhead, to the safety of the parking lot where people were. I didn't care if I was making a scene. I just wanted out. But as I looked behind me, there was nothing, no movement, no sign of anything following me. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling. I broke into a full sprint, my breath coming in sharp bursts, the world around me blurring. The whispers had now turned into a low murmur, like a chant, rhythmic, but still unintelligible. I tried to push them out of my mind, focusing on the trail ahead, but they wouldn't stop. They followed me, as if they were carried by the wind itself, staying just a step behind, relentless. My legs burned as I pushed harder, running faster, the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't outrun the whispers. They were there, always just on the edge of hearing, a constant hum, like an uninvited guest that wouldn't leave. I didn't know how much time passed as I ran, the trail seeming to stretch on forever. But my mind was clear enough to know I needed to get back to the trailhead. I didn't care about the views, about finishing the hike. All I cared about now was getting back to where people were. It didn't matter if it sounded irrational. I had to go. I rounded a corner, the end of the trail finally coming into view. The parking lot was just ahead. Relief hit me like a wave. I was almost there. My breath came in ragged gasps as I slowed, the whispers fading slightly as the trailhead came closer. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. The forest stood still, peaceful, too peaceful. I reached the end of the trail, my hands shaking as I grabbed my pack from the ground and started walking quickly toward my car. I didn't want to look back anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd felt out, there was still close, lingering in the woods behind me. I didn't stop until I was safely in my car, the engine roaring to life as I slammed the door shut. My hands were trembling on the wheel, my heart still racing. I couldn't explain it. There had been no one out there. No animals, no people. Just me, the wind, and the whispers. I drove away, the familiar landscape around me feeling strange, as if I was seeing it for the first time. The whispers had stopped, but the unease remained, crawling under my skin. I still don't know what happened that day. I've been back to the trail since, though. I don't tell anyone about the whispers. I don't tell anyone about the feeling of being watched. People who hike, they don't need to know that sometimes the wind can carry more than just the sounds of nature. They don't need to know that sometimes the woods themselves can whisper. It was a late night, and I was driving through a remote stretch of highway somewhere in the middle of nowhere. The road stretched out endlessly, surrounded by trees and rugged terrain that felt like it went on for miles without a single sign of civilization. My headlights cut through the thick darkness, illuminating nothing but empty road and the occasional silhouette of trees. It was the kind of desolate stretch that made you feel like you were the only person left on Earth. I had been driving for hours, The only sound was the hum of my car's engine and the tires on the pavement. I hadn't seen another car for what seemed like an eternity. My eyes were getting heavy, and I had to fight to keep from nodding off. I'd been on the road since early morning, and I still had a good few hours left to go before I reached my destination. The only rest stops were tiny, run-down places off the highway, and none of them seemed inviting. I wasn't exactly in the mood to pull over into a dimly lit, deserted area. I kept pushing forward, telling myself that I'd stop soon. The road ahead was empty, just a narrow strip of asphalt cutting through the dark, with no lights and no signs of life. That's when I saw her. I first noticed a figure standing in the middle of the road, maybe 100 yards ahead. At first, I thought it was just a mirage or a trick of the headlights. It was late, my eyes were tired, and the road had been playing tricks on me all night. But as I got closer, I saw that it was a woman, standing alone in the middle of the highway. She was dressed in a white dress, though I couldn't make out much more than that. Her hair seemed long, maybe dark, though the headlights didn't show enough for me to be sure. What struck me immediately was how she was just standing there, completely still, with her arms slightly outstretched as if she was waiting for something. It wasn't normal. Nobody just stands in the middle of a highway at this hour. I instinctively hit the brakes, slowing the car down as I got closer. Something about the whole situation made me uneasy. Was she in trouble? Maybe stranded? My mind raced as I tried to think of any possible explanation. As I neared her, I could see her more clearly now. She wasn't moving at all, not even a twitch. It was like she was frozen in time, her gaze fixed on me, though I couldn't make out any details of her face from the distance. I slowed the car down to a crawl, my foot hovering over the brake in case I needed to stop completely. There were no other cars in sight, and the road was narrow. If I passed her without stopping, I might hit her. I couldn't just leave her there, even though everything about the situation felt off. I was close now, within maybe 20 feet of her, and I could see that she wasn't moving at all. No sign of life. She didn't flinch when I slowed down, didn't even seem to acknowledge the sound of the car's engine. That's when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. And then, just as I was about to roll my window down, to ask her if she needed help, she vanished. I'm not talking about her walking away or running into the woods. I mean, she was standing right there, and then, just as quickly as I'd seen her, she was gone. Like someone had just erased her from existence. I slammed my foot on the brake, the car coming to an immediate halt in the middle of the road. My heart was pounding in my chest, adrenaline surging through my body. I looked around, my eyes frantically searching the darkness for any sign of her, but there was nothing. The road was empty, completely empty. I sat there for a moment, my mind reeling. I couldn't process what had just happened. It didn't make sense. How could someone just disappear like that? I had seen her, no doubt about it. I wasn't imagining things. I hadn't fallen asleep at the wheel. My eyes had been wide open the entire time. And yet, she was gone. I tried to tell myself that I must have been seeing things, that my exhaustion had gotten the better of me. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or some weird optical illusion created by the headlights bouncing off the road. But the more I thought about it, the less convinced I was that I had just imagined it. Something about the way she had been standing there, motionless, unnaturally still, felt real. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I should have just kept driving, but I couldn't shake the image of her standing there, waiting. It felt wrong to just drive away, to pretend like nothing had happened. But what else could I do? There was no sign of her. I couldn't just stop and walk around looking for her in the dark. I was out in the middle of nowhere, and there was no telling what could be out there in the woods or along the road. With a heavy sigh, I put the car in gear and started driving again. Slowly this time, my eyes scanning the road ahead for any sign of movement. My hands were still shaking a little, but I forced myself to calm down. This was ridiculous. It had to be some kind of weird optical illusion or a hallucination brought on by my exhaustion. That's all it could have been. But as I continued down the road, my mind kept returning to that strange, eerie moment. What had I really seen? Why had she been standing there in the middle of nowhere, on that empty stretch of highway? And why did she vanish without a trace? As I drove, I kept my eyes peeled for any other signs of life, though there was nothing. Just endless dark road and trees on either side. The silence was deafening. It wasn't until a few miles down the road that I finally saw something. A car, parked off to the side, hidden among the trees. My heart skipped a beat as I slowed down, wondering if someone else had been out there. Maybe it was the woman. Maybe she had walked to her car after disappearing. I passed the car cautiously, but there was no one around. No sign of life. I kept driving, but my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about what I had seen or thought I had seen. My heart kept pounding as I glanced nervously into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone chasing me down the road. It wasn't until I reached the next small town that I felt like I could finally breathe. I pulled into a gas station, the bright lights of the pumps reassuring against the darkness that surrounded me. I parked and sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to calm down. My hands were still shaking, and my heart was still beating fast. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I went inside to grab a coffee, trying to steady myself to get my head back on straight. As I walked to the counter, I overheard a conversation between the cashier and a truck driver who had just pulled in. I swear, I've been seeing more strange stuff out there lately, the truck driver said, his voice low. A woman in a white dress, standing in the middle of the highway. Just like that. I froze in my tracks, my blood running cold. I had to turn around and listen. The locals talk about it, the cashier said. People have been reporting it for weeks now. Some say it's nothing, just a trick of the light. But you don't see it in a place like this unless it's real. I didn't stick around to hear more. I paid for my coffee, walked out to my car, and drove away as fast as I could. I had always loved camping. The quiet, the solitude, and the escape from the hustle of everyday life were things I craved. This particular weekend, I had chosen a spot near a secluded lake I had heard about from a fellow hiker. It wasn't a popular camping area, more of a hidden gem tucked away deep in the woods. The kind of place where you could truly disconnect. No cell phone signal, no distractions, just a wilderness and yourself. I arrived late in the afternoon after a long drive. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting an orange glow across the trees as I set up my tent by the edge of the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the surrounding pine trees like a mirror. The stillness of the place was almost unnerving, but in a way that I found soothing. I built a fire, threw a few logs on it, and sat back, listening to the crackling flames. The air was cool, and the night was settling in. I hadn't seen another soul when I arrived, and that suited me just fine. However, as the light faded and the stars started to appear, I noticed a small group of campers had set up their tents a little farther down the lake. From the looks of it, they were just a couple of people, maybe a man and a woman. They were talking, laughing, and enjoying their evening. I could hear snippets of their conversation, but it wasn't intrusive. It felt like a normal camping scene, no different than the many I had experienced in the past. After a while, I decided to turn in for the night. The temperature had dropped, and the warmth of my sleeping bag was too inviting. I rolled into the tent, zipped it up, and settled in. I could still hear their voices faintly from a distance, but it was calming. It felt good to be in nature, surrounded by trees, the lake, and the sounds of wildlife. The night passed slowly. There were occasional rustlings outside my tent, likely animals moving through the forest, but nothing alarming. I drifted in and out of sleep, the sound of the crackling fire nearby lulling me into a peaceful slumber. At some point, I heard a loud splash from the lake. Maybe a fish jumping or something larger, but it didn't bother me. It was just part of the night. Morning came, and I woke up to the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees. I lay there for a while, listening to the quiet and stretching my limbs. The birds were already awake, calling to one another from the treetops. The air felt crisp, and the ground was still damp from the previous night's dew. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, taking in a deep breath of fresh morning air. It was a peaceful scene, exactly what I had come for. As I looked around, my gaze naturally drifted to the campsite of the couple that had set up nearby. It wasn't far from where I had pitched my own tent, just a little down the shore. But as I looked, something was off. The tents were gone. No one was around. No smoke from a campfire. The area looked empty, like they had never been there at all. It wasn't just that they weren't there. It was that everything was completely gone, and yet there were signs they had been there just hours before. Their campfire pit, though no longer burning, still had smoldering embers that gave off a faint glow. It was almost as if they had just left, but in a hurry. Half-eaten food was left behind. 2 open cans of beans, one tipped over and spilling its contents on the ground. A few pieces of bread were scattered near the fire, and some coffee cups lay abandoned in the dirt. I couldn't see any trash bags or belongings that they might have packed away. Just stuff, just sitting there, as if they'd gotten up and walked off without a care. I stood there for a while, staring at the sight, trying to make sense of it. It was a strange thing to witness. People don't usually just leave their things behind like that, especially when it wasn't even morning yet, and it was far too early for people to be packing up. But that was exactly what had happened. No sign of struggle, no obvious signs of something having gone wrong, just the evidence of their departure, as if they had vanished. I felt a chill run down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was just the eeriness of the empty camp, or maybe it was the fact that I had just arrived and felt this strange disconnect between the world I was in and the world they had left behind. I walked closer to their camp, inspecting the remains of their fire. The ashes were cold to the touch, but there was still a faint smell of burnt wood and something off. It was a mix of wet leaves and charred metal, an oddly pungent scent that lingered in the air. I glanced around, wondering if they had packed up and left early for some reason, maybe to hike out or catch a ride. But the more I looked, the less sense it made. The lake was still, with no signs of recent activity. No boats, no people along the shore. It was just quiet. I turned around and walked back toward my tent, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. I didn't want to overthink things. It was a campground, after all. People come and go. Maybe they had just left early, or maybe they'd gone for a walk. Maybe they had a reason to leave in the middle of the night. But none of that explained why their belongings were left behind. I shrugged it off, reminding myself that it was just a strange coincidence. I wasn't going to let it ruin my weekend. I packed up my own gear and decided to take a walk around the lake to clear my head. I needed some time to think about what I had seen. The morning was quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. I walked along the shore, keeping my eyes peeled for any signs of the couple or their tracks. Nothing. The ground was soft from the recent rain, and I could see the prints of animals, raccoons, squirrels, maybe a deer, but there were no human tracks. Nothing to suggest that anyone had passed through recently. I spent the next few hours walking around the area, looking for anything out of the ordinary. I didn't find anything. No signs of struggle, no hidden dangers. Just the same quiet, empty forest. As I walked, I began to feel a bit silly. The whole thing was probably just a misunderstanding. Maybe they had gone for a swim or a walk in the woods and left their things behind for a moment. There had to be a rational explanation, right? But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I kept thinking about their campfire, how it had still been smoking when I woke up, but there was no sign of life. No signs that they had packed up and left in a hurry, either. It was as if they had just disappeared. By mid-afternoon, I had walked far enough around the lake to reach a small trail that led into the woods. I decided to follow it, hoping it would lead me to some answers. Maybe the couple had hiked up this trail or had gone off to explore. I walked for a while, the trail winding through thick trees and underbrush. The deeper I went, the more isolated it felt. The only sounds now were my footsteps on the dirt and the occasional crack of a branch breaking somewhere in the distance. I kept walking, my thoughts still focused on the strange disappearance of the campers. What if something had happened to them? What if they had run into trouble? What if they had gotten lost? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thoughts. It was just a coincidence. They were fine, but the further I went, the more unsettling the forest became. The trees seemed taller, denser. The underbrush thickened, and the air grew cooler. The feeling of isolation grew stronger. After what felt like hours, I decided to turn back. There was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no sound of voices, nothing. When I returned to the lake, the camp was still empty. The belongings had not been touched. and the food remained where it had been. The fire pit was still cold. It had been hours since I first noticed the abandoned campsite, and there was still no sign of the couple. No evidence that they had ever been there. As I sat by the edge of the lake, I began to realize that maybe they hadn't left at all. Maybe something had happened to them. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave. The absence of any signs of life around their camp. No tracks, no disturbance in the forest, nothing was starting to gnaw at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As night began to fall, I reluctantly packed up my gear and decided to leave. The thought of staying another night, alone by that empty campsite, was too much for me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I needed to go. Fast, I drove out of the area, my headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't look back. The next day, I called the local ranger station to report what I had seen. The ranger who answered was friendly, but seemed puzzled by my story. He told me that no one had reported any missing persons in the area. When I asked about the couple, he said he didn't know of any campers in the area that morning. I mentioned their abandoned camp, but the ranger didn't seem concerned. He assured me that sometimes people leave early and forget things behind, and that things like that happen all the time. I didn't believe him. I still didn't, but there was no explanation. I'll never know what happened to those campers, or why they left without a trace. All I have is the memory of their camp, and the eerie feeling that something happened that day, something I'll never fully understand. I was driving through a rural part of the state, the kind of place where the roads get narrow and the trees grow thick on both sides, making everything feel enclosed. It was a late afternoon, and the sky was starting to look like a faded painting, the clouds heavy with the promise of rain. I had been on the road for hours, just trying to get to my destination, and the miles had started to blur together. The radio was silent, the kind of quiet that happens when you've been driving alone for too long. It was just me and the road, and the endless stretch of nothing around me. I'd passed a few farms, the occasional barn, and a handful of rundown houses scattered along the edges of the highway. There was something about this stretch of road that felt wrong, though something off, like I was driving through a place forgotten by time. It wasn't that it was dark or creepy, but there was a certain stillness, a kind of heaviness in the air. The trees along the road were thick, their branches hanging low and tangled, blocking out most of the light. I felt like I was being swallowed up by the landscape, like the world outside the car didn't exist anymore. I wasn't paying much attention to the houses I passed, but as I came up on one, something made me glance over. It was a small, dilapidated house, barely standing. The porch was sagging. The roof looked like it might cave in at any moment, and the windows were dusty and cracked. The yard was overgrown, the grass wild and untamed, curling around the old wood like it was trying to reclaim it. Everything about that house screamed abandonment. It was the kind of place you expected to see in horror movies, the type of house you'd be warned not to approach. I almost kept driving, but something caught my eye. A figure stood by the window, almost blending in with the shadows. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but I knew they were watching me. It was that feeling, the hairs on the back of your neck standing up, the sense that you're being observed. The figure was motionless, standing in the window, staring at me as I passed. I didn't think much of it first. It could have been a neighbor, maybe someone out on the porch, or just peering out the window. But as I kept driving, the uneasy feeling stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing. Probably just my imagination running wild, the kind of thing that happens when you're alone on the road for too long. But as I reached the bend in the road and glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart skipped a beat. The figure was outside now, standing just beyond the edge of the porch. It was almost like they'd teleported there, or worse, they had been standing in the shadows waiting for me to pass. They were still staring at me. Their figure was barely discernible in the dimming light, but I could make out the silhouette of someone watching me, unmoving, their posture stiff and rigid. I felt my pulse quicken. The blood rushed to my head, and I couldn't stop staring back at the figure through the rearview mirror. My eyes were glued to that one spot, like I was afraid if I looked away for even a second, they'd disappear or worse, get closer. I glanced back at the road quickly, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. I shouldn't have looked. I shouldn't have kept glancing in that mirror. But I did it again. The figure hadn't moved. They were still standing there, but this time they were closer, much closer. It was like they had taken a step forward in the few seconds it took me to look back and forth. I didn't know if my mind was playing tricks on me, but I could have sworn the figure had moved in the span of a heartbeat. I wasn't sure if I should stop, if maybe I should go back and check if everything was okay, but a part of me, the more rational part, told me to keep going. There was nothing to be afraid of, right? People lived in these kinds of houses all the time, maybe even with strange habits. Hell, they might have been standing out there just to watch the traffic go by, nothing more. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I didn't want to risk it. I didn't want to be part of whatever strange thing was happening there. So I pushed down the fear creeping up my spine, forced myself to breathe steady, and kept my eyes on the road, speeding up just a little to put more distance between me and that house. I glanced back at the mirror once more, and that's when I saw it. The figure wasn't standing by the window anymore. It was standing in the middle of the road, just up ahead. It had crossed from the house to the highway without making a sound, like a shadow slipping through the trees. I could barely make out their shape, but they were standing there, right in the middle of the road, watching me. Their figure was still as stone, and for a moment, I thought they might not even be real. Maybe it was just the dim light playing tricks on my eyes. Maybe I was tired, worn out from the long drive. But I wasn't that tired. My hands were sweating, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off of them. I didn't know if they were waiting for me to stop, or if they were simply watching as I passed. But I didn't want to find out. I slammed my foot on the gas, feeling the car lurch forward as the engine roared to life. The figure stayed there, unmoving. My headlights illuminated the area around them for a split second, but I didn't dare look to see if they had moved. I couldn't afford to. As I sped past, I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, trying to push the image of that figure out of my mind. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, and I had to force myself to take a few deep breaths to calm down. But no matter how much I tried to push it away, that figure kept coming back to me. They were still out there, standing in the middle of that road, waiting for someone. I kept driving, not daring to glance in the rearview mirror again. I didn't want to see anything else. I didn't want to know if they had followed me or if they were still out there, standing in the dark. It wasn't until I reached the next town, another hour down the road, that I finally pulled over to catch my breath. My hands were still trembling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What I seen back there? Who was that figure, and why were they watching me? I sat there in the car for a long time, staring out the windshield, trying to make sense of it all. It felt like something I couldn't explain, something that didn't belong in the world I knew. But as I sat there, I realized one thing. Whatever that figure was, it had never been about me. I wasn't the one they were watching. They were waiting for someone else. And the thought of that was even worse than the feeling of being watched. I had always been drawn to the mountains. There was something about the vast, untamed wilderness that called to me, a place where silence held a certain weight, where every breath of wind felt like a secret. I've been hiking alone for years, and this ridge had become one of my favorite spots. It wasn't particularly popular or well-known, which made it feel like a hidden gem, a place I could lose myself to the rhythm of the climb. The morning was crisp, the air still cool from the previous night's frost. The sun hadn't fully broken over the ridge yet, casting long, cool shadows on the trail. The dirt path was firm beneath my boots, the crunch of gravel the only sound accompanying my steady footsteps. I hadn't planned for a long hike today, just a quick trek up to the top of the ridge to catch the view and then head back. My pack was light, just a few essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my camera. The kind of gear I could carry without thinking about it. I was about halfway up when I saw it. A figure standing at the top of the ridge. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, something my eyes were playing on me. The morning sun was still low, and the shadows could easily make things seem out of place. But no, there was definitely someone standing there. It wasn't like any hiker I'd ever seen. The figure was too still, too unmoving. From where I stood, it was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. just a silhouette against the sky, dark and sharp. It was a human shape, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The way it was positioned, the way it stood there without any movement, it didn't feel natural. It was as if it was just watching, waiting. I froze for a moment, my heart skipping a beat. I didn't want to make any assumptions, but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling crawling up my spine. I called out, my voice loud against the emptiness of the mountain. "Hey, you get up there." My words were swallowed by the wind. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even flinch. It was like it didn't hear me, or worse, like it wasn't alive at all. That thought shot through me like a bolt of electricity. I took a step forward, my eyes never leaving it, but still, there was no movement, no response. I called again, louder this time, my voice tinged with irritation and nervous energy. "Hey, are you okay?" Nothing. No answer. No sign of life. The figure just stood there, staring down at me. The longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. There was something off about the way it stood, like it didn't belong in the world of flesh and blood. There was no way to explain it logically, no way to put into words the way my instincts screamed at me to run. So, I did what my gut told me to do. I turned around. My hands are shaking slightly as I reached for my water bottle, trying to force myself to focus on anything but the figure. The sound of my own breath was harsh in my ears as I tried to ignore the growing sense of unease that had begun to fill the space around me. I knew I had to get off that ridge. I had no reason to be scared. I was alone, yes, but I was experienced, and this trail wasn't dangerous, but it didn't matter. Something about the figure had rattled me to the core. I started to descend the trail, but I didn't look away. I couldn't. I had to keep my eyes on it, keep it in view. Every step down the ridge felt like it was dragging me farther from safety, farther from something I couldn't quite put into words. My pace quickened as I made my way down, my boots slipping slightly on the loose dirt. But I didn't care about the footing anymore. I just needed to be far away from that thing, whatever it was. With every step I took, the distance between us grew, but it felt like it wasn't enough. My heart raced, my breath coming out in shallow bursts. I kept telling myself it was fine. It was just a person. Maybe they were hiking in the opposite direction, and I hadn't seen them move yet. Maybe they were just resting or taking in the view. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more the unease dug in. My eyes never left the figure, but now the shadows were lengthening, the sun creeping higher in the sky. The light had shifted enough that I could see more clearly, just enough to confirm something I already knew. The figure was still standing there. It hadn't moved an inch. I gripped my pack straps tighter, my knuckles white. It wasn't right. Nothing about this felt right. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched, that it wasn't just standing there for the view. The air around me felt too heavy, like I wasn't alone, even though I was the only person on the trail. My footsteps echoed in the silence, the rhythm of them growing faster, more frantic as I descended. Every part of me screamed to turn around and run, but I didn't. Something told me not to take my eyes off it. So I kept going, one foot after another, my gaze locked on the top of the ridge. The figure didn't move, didn't even twitch. It felt like hours passed, though I knew it had only been minutes. The closer I got to the base of the ridge, the more my fear morphed into something else, something primal, something I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the kind of fear you can't reason with, the kind that doesn't care about logic or experience. It's the kind of fear that makes you feel small and insignificant, like you're being hunted by something you can't even see. I reached the point where the trail split, where I could either continue down or head off into a small clearing. My legs burned from the descent, but I didn't care. I veered toward the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't stop yet, not until I was sure I was far enough away. For the first time in years, I felt the urge to look behind me, to check if I was still being followed. But I didn't. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, my breath ragged. The clearing was empty, silent. It seemed like a safe place, a place where I could catch my breath, gather myself, and try to make sense of what was happening. But even as I stepped into the clearing, I didn't feel safe. The fear hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had only grown. I was still too close to that figure. Then as I stood there, my heart hammering, I felt it, a shift in the air. a feeling that the mountain itself had drawn a breath. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, but I could feel it. Something was moving, just beyond the trees, just beyond the clearing. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there. I held my breath, straining to listen. And then I heard it, a sound. Not a voice, but a soft rustling, like someone walking through the brush. A step, and then another. It was behind me, slowly, deliberately. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable. My blood ran cold. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body screamed to stay still, to stay silent. But I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, of something lurking just out of sight, waiting. And that's when I understood the worst part of it all. The figure on the ridge wasn't alone. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the world pressing in. My legs were stiff, my chest tight, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Not until I was sure. Not until the rustling stopped, or I could finally bring myself to look. But it never stopped. The rustling came closer, louder now, but still I didn't look back. I was frozen, caught between fear and instinct. I had to get out of there. I had to leave. But the way out wasn't just a matter of turning around and walking back to the car. I had to move carefully, quietly. Every step felt like it could be my last. So I stayed still listening, waiting for whatever was out there to move on. And then just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The rustling faded into the distance, and the air around me felt lighter. I waited for a long time before I could bring myself to stand. The silence was oppressive, but I knew it was safe to leave now. I didn't need to look back. I didn't need to know what had been out there. When I finally made it to the car, I didn't waste any time. I got in, started the engine, and drove away, my hands trembling on the wheel. I never looked back, but there was one thing I knew for sure. The figure on the ridge hadn't been the only one watching me. I've been hiking for hours, the trail twisting and turning beneath my boots, the sound of the crunching earth beneath my feet blending with the distant rustling of leaves in the trees. It was one of those perfect autumn days where the sun is bright but not too hot, and the air is crisp enough to fill your lungs with life. The kind of day you can lose yourself in. I was out in the woods, miles from the nearest road, just me and the forest. There was something peaceful about it, like the trees and the breeze held all the time in the world, and I could just walk through it all, unnoticed. I had been hiking along a familiar trail, one I'd done countless times before, but today something felt different. There was this strange quiet, not the kind that comes with peace, but the kind that makes you uneasy. I couldn't shake it. Every step felt heavier than the last, and every snap of a twig made me jump. I figure it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe it was the isolation getting to me. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to walk single file. On either side, thick woods closed in, the canopy above filtering the sunlight into slivers of warmth that barely touched the forest floor. The trail had this damp, earthy smell to it, like the ground had been untouched for years, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. It wasn't until I rounded a bend that I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, something my eyes were making up, but no, it was there unmistakably real. An old mirror leaning against a tree. Now, I've been hiking in this area for years, and I knew these woods well enough to recognize when something was out of place. This was one of those times. The mirror stood alone, its surface cracked and weathered, the frame of dark wood that had been eaten by time and the elements. It looked like it had been there for years, abandoned and forgotten. It was odd, no question about it. Who would leave a mirror out here, miles from anywhere? I took a few steps closer, my curiosity overpowering any caution I might have had. The glass was dirty, covered in streaks and grime, but I could still see my reflection in it. I was surprised to see how worn I looked, despite just being on a hike. The wind had picked up slightly, causing the trees to creak and sway, and I adjusted my pack, my eyes still on the mirror. The reflection staring back at me seemed normal enough. There I was in my hiking boots and jacket, my hair a little messier than I'd like, but nothing unusual. But then something caught my eye in the reflection, something I couldn't explain. a figure standing just behind me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't turn immediately, thinking it was just a trick of the light or my mind playing games on me. I had read stories about people thinking they saw something in reflections, only to realize it was just their brain filling in the blanks. But the longer I stared at the mirror, the more I realized how wrong it felt. The figure in the reflection was tall, dressed in dark clothes, the outline blurred but still unmistakable. The problem was when I turned around to see who was behind me, there was no one there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart skipped a beat. I spun back to the mirror, my breath quickening. The figure was still there, still just standing behind me, close enough to feel the weight of its presence, but not close enough to touch. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stared. I turned again, faster this time, hoping to catch someone out of the corner of my eye, thinking maybe it was another hiker or someone else who had wandered off the trail. But again, there was nothing, just a forest, trees, leaves, and the distant sound of a bird calling out somewhere far off. Panic bubbled up inside me, and I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. I backed away slowly, my eyes glued to the mirror, but the figure didn't follow. It stayed there, in the reflection, as though it had no interest in me. It was almost like it was waiting for something, like it knew I was watching. I took another step back, my mind racing. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe the mirror had been placed here for some kind of weird, artistic reason. But none of that made sense either. I had seen the woods empty for miles. No sign of anyone or anything. There was no one out here. Then I remembered something. A few years back, I had heard rumors about strange things happening in these woods. Stories about hikers finding things that didn't belong, things that made no sense. I had always brushed them off, chalking them up to local superstition or people's overactive imaginations. But now, standing in front of that mirror, something felt wrong. Like the stories might not have been as far-fetched as I'd thought. My pulse was racing. The woods were silent again, the kind of silence that presses on you, making your skin crawl. I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay here, not with that thing staring at me through the glass, its presence hanging over me like a shadow. I stepped backward, my eyes still fixed on the mirror. It was almost as if the forest itself had gone quiet, waiting for me to make a move. I turned, my boots hitting the dirt path with purpose, my heart still pounding in my chest. But no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, that it was still watching me, that whatever had been in that mirror wasn't just some figment of my imagination. I kept walking, my mind whirling with thoughts, trying to convince myself it was nothing. That it was just a weird encounter, and there was no reason to get worked up. But the longer I walked, the more that feeling grew, creeping up my spine. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking when I saw it again. The feeling of being watched. The same chill that had crept over me before. But now it was different. It felt closer. I glanced behind me, my throat dry. The woods were still empty, nothing moving. No sign of life. Yet, that feeling didn't go away. It was as if the air had shifted, and I was no longer alone. I was getting near the end of the trail now, where it would loop back to the parking lot. But that's when I saw it again, something not right in the trees up ahead. For a moment, my heart stopped. There, standing in the distance, was a figure, just standing there in the middle of the trail, not moving, just like in the reflection. But this time, when I turned around, I didn't feel the panic rise immediately. Something in me had clicked. I understood. I wasn't seeing a ghost or anything supernatural. I wasn't being hunted by some entity or spirit. I was just being paranoid. That was all it was. The figure in the reflection had been nothing but my own reflection twisting in the mirror's grime. The anxiety I had felt earlier was just the woods playing tricks on me, the isolation and quiet messing with my head. It was all in my head. I walked faster now, reaching the end of the trail in a few minutes, the familiar sounds of the parking lot in the distance. The air felt lighter. I had been working myself up over nothing. I passed the place where the mirror had been. Now, just a memory in the back of my mind, something I'd laugh off later. It was a strange sight, yes, but I wasn't about to let it freak me out. I had seen enough odd things in my time hiking to know that sometimes the world just throws weird stuff in your path. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was breathing easier. I was back to where I'd started, everything feeling familiar again. I put the thought of the mirror behind me. It was just an object after all. It didn't mean anything. But the thing was, every time I looked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Even now, as I drove away from the trailhead, I couldn't fully rid myself of the sensation. It wasn't fear anymore. It was a deeper, more unsettling thought that maybe I hadn't been alone out there after all. I've always been someone who loves the outdoors. I've spent countless nights camping by myself, finding peace in the quiet solitude of the forest. There's something about being out in the wild, alone with nature, that clears my mind. But there are nights when the woods aren't as peaceful as they seem. This particular night, I was camping in a remote spot, far from any trailhead or campground. I had hiked in alone, carrying my gear with me. The sky had been clear, the sun setting in a beautiful orange hue, and everything seemed perfect for a night in the wilderness. I had my tent set up, the campfire crackling softly nearby, and my food was cooking over the flame. Everything was as it should be. As the night grew darker and the fire burned low, I settled into my sleeping bag, my eyes heavy with the quiet rhythm of the night. The sounds of the forest surrounded me, the occasional rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the chirp of crickets. But as the clock neared midnight, something changed. I was lying on my side, staring at the entrance of my tent, trying to ignore the unease that had started to settle in my stomach. It was just a nagging feeling, nothing that I could pinpoint exactly. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the fact that I was alone in the woods, with no one for miles. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock on the fabric of my tent door. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was knocking on my tent. I'm no stranger to the odd noise in the woods. Animals often wander into campsites, knocking over branches or rustling in the underbrush. But this wasn't that. This was a knock, like someone was outside my tent, actively trying to get my attention. I lay there in the dark, not moving, barely breathing. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a curious deer brushing against my tent. But something about it didn't sit right. The knock wasn't random, like an animal might do. It was precise, measured. I could feel my pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I told myself to stay calm, that it was probably nothing. Maybe someone else was camping nearby, though I knew for certain I hadn't seen any other tents on my hike in. The nearest campground was miles away. Then, after a moment of silence, the whispering started. It was faint at first, too soft to make out any words, but I could hear it clearly enough to know that it was a voice. A low, indistinct murmur, like someone was speaking in hushed tones just beyond the fabric of my tent. My mind raced. I tried to convince myself that it was the wind or the trees creaking under the weight of the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone or something out there. The whispering continued, growing slightly louder but still unintelligible. It felt as though it was coming from all around me, like it was floating through the air, swirling around my tent. The words were too soft to understand, but it was the tone that unsettled me. There was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't normal. I tried to stay as still as possible, my eyes fixed on the dark, the entrance of the tent barely visible in the dim light. My breath was shallow, and my body was frozen, a mixture of fear and confusion paralyzing me. Another knock came, this time louder. 3 quick raps, like a person's knuckles striking the door of my tent. I couldn't stay still anymore. I slowly reached for my flashlight, which was tucked in my backpack. My fingers trembled, but I managed to grab it, flipping it on with a soft click. I hesitated before unzipping the tent slightly, just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The area around my campsite was dark, the fire now reduced to nothing more than embers. I could see the outline of trees surrounding me, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. No movement, no sign of anyone. I quickly zipped the tent back up, my heart racing in my chest. The last thing I wanted to do was venture out into the dark alone, but the sound of the knocks and the whispers were still fresh in my mind. I was far from any other campers, and if someone was out there, they had to be close. The whispers continued, but now they sounded like they were right outside the tent, just on the other side of the thin fabric. I couldn't make out the words, but I could tell it wasn't just one voice. There were multiple voices, speaking in unison, but still too faint to understand. My instincts told me to stay quiet, to listen, to wait. But I felt a growing sense of urgency. I needed to know what was out there. My mind kept running through possibilities. Maybe it was some prank, someone from another campsite messing with me. Maybe someone had gotten lost in the woods and was trying to find help. But deep down, I knew that wasn't likely. I glanced around inside my tent, trying to reassure myself. My gear was still where I had left it. My food was untouched, but the whispers kept growing, louder now, like they were right at the edge of my tent. The knocking started again, this time a bit more frantic, as if the person was getting impatient. The soft whispers mixed with the sound of something else, footsteps, maybe, or something shifting in the underbrush. I had to do something. I couldn't just lie there, helpless. Slowly, I pulled out my pocket knife, gripping it tightly. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I waited in the dark, listening. The sounds had stopped for a moment. For a brief second, everything was completely silent. But then I heard something else. A slow, deliberate drag, like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. It was coming closer. I turned off the flashlight, keeping it tucked away. I knew I had to be quiet, stay hidden. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. If someone was out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, until it was almost right outside my tent. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot. Then the sound stopped. I was nearly holding my breath when I heard it, the softest tap on the tent. Not a knock, a tap, light, gentle, almost as if someone was testing the fabric to see if I was still inside. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I slowly unzipped the tent, just a crack, to peek outside once more. This time, there was something there. A figure, standing just beyond the glow of the dying embers of my campfire. It was a person, but they were hunched low, almost crouched down, their face hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see enough to know that they weren't in any kind of hurry. I froze. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, facing the tent, as if waiting for something. I couldn't hear them breathing, couldn't hear anything but the wind in the trees. My mind raced. Who was this person? Why were they standing so still? Should I call out? Should I try to confront them? Before I could make up my mind, the figure turned away, slowly, as if uninterested in me at all, and began walking away into the woods. I didn't move for several minutes. I couldn't. My body was frozen in fear, not knowing what to do. Eventually, I heard the footsteps fade into the distance. Then silence. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, my heart still pounding in my chest, but I never heard another sound. No more knocks, no more whispers. The forest returned to its usual nighttime hum, and I managed to drift off into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I packed up my campsite quickly, too shaken to stay any longer. As I made my way back to the trailhead, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints near my tent. They weren't mine. They were large, heavy steps, more like the prints of someone who had been walking in boots, and they had circled my tent several times, coming and going, as if the person had been there for hours, watching me. I never went back to that spot. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I only know that it was something I couldn't explain. And for me, that's all that matters. It was late at night when I stepped outside my cabin to get some fresh air. The air was cool, almost crisp, and the quiet of the woods around me felt soothing after a long day. I had been staying in this small cabin for a couple of days now, taking a break from everything, hoping the solitude would give me some peace. The cabin was tucked away on the edge of a forest, miles from the nearest town, with no neighbors for miles. It was the perfect place to escape. I closed the door behind me, feeling the wooden frame creak slightly as I did. I took a deep breath, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, but it was enough to give the landscape a soft, eerie glow. The forest stretched out ahead of me, dark and still. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel small, like the forest is holding its breath. I stood there for a few moments, listening to the rustling of the wind in the trees, the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. It was peaceful, but there was an underlying tension in the air that I couldn't shake. I've been here alone for a while now, and while the isolation was nice, it also made me more aware of every sound, every movement in the woods. That's when I saw them. Two glowing red eyes staring at me from the darkness. They were positioned low to the ground, just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible. At first, I thought it was just some animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But the eyes didn't move. They stayed fixed on me, unblinking and unmoving. I squinted, trying to make out the shape of whatever it was, but all I saw were those two red eyes, burning like embers in the dark. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My first instinct was to step back, to go inside and lock the door. But curiosity got the better of me. I took a slow step forward, straining my eyes to get a better look. The eyes didn't move. They just stared at me, unblinking. I felt a cold sweat begin to form on the back of my neck. Something wasn't right. I could feel it deep down, a sense of wrongness in the air. I took another step, my shoes crunching on the dry leaves and twigs underfoot. As I got closer, I realized the eyes weren't reflecting the moonlight. They were their own light, an unnatural, eerie glow that didn't make sense in the natural world. I stopped, my feet frozen to the ground. The more I looked at the eyes, the more unnerving they became. They seemed to be watching me, studying me, waiting for something. A part of me wanted to turn around and run back into the cabin, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. My pulse was racing, each beat louder than the last. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the air felt thicker now, harder to breathe. I forced myself to take another step, then another, slowly closing the distance between myself and whatever was in the woods. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt the familiar prickling sensation of being watched, not by something in the woods, but by something that wasn't quite right. The distance between us was shrinking, and I could feel the tension in my chest tightening with each passing second. My mind was telling me to turn around, to go back to the safety of the cabin, but my feet kept moving forward, drawn to those eyes as if something was compelling me to get closer. It was like the darkness itself was pulling me in. When I was only about 15 feet away, I froze. The eyes didn't move. They stayed fixed on me, unmoving, but there was something else. A shift in the air, like the forest had become even more silent, as if the world was holding its breath. I could hear the soft rustling of the wind in the trees, but it felt distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my hand was shaking. I took another step forward, this time slower, more cautiously, my feet barely making a sound on the ground. As I closed the distance, I started to see more details in the shadows, shapes, outlines, things that I couldn't quite make out. The eyes remained the same, fixed on me, but something about the way they glowed, the intensity, made my stomach churn. They weren't just staring at me anymore. They felt like they were studying me, probing, waiting for something. My skin crawled. I was about 5 feet away now, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but the air seemed thick, suffocating. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move. They were like two burning coals, casting an unsettling glow into the night. I couldn't take it anymore. Fear surged through me like a wave, crashing over everything else. My mind screamed at me to run, to get back to the cabin, to get away from whatever the hell was out there. I turned on my heel and sprinted toward the cabin, not looking back. My feet pounded against the dirt and the dry leaves as I ran, the sound of my breath ragged in my ears. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My heart was still racing, my mind a blur of panic. I leaned against the door, my back pressed to the rough wood as I tried to catch my breath. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know what I had seen, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't just an animal. It wasn't anything natural. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing with thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes. They were still burned into my mind, like they were staring at me from the dark. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or something else, but I knew it wasn't. Bears don't have glowing red eyes. I tried to push the thoughts away, to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the isolation was getting to me. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw them again. Those red eyes staring back at me, unmoving, unblinking. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring out the window, watching the dark woods. Every rustle, every movement made my heart race. The moon had risen higher in the sky, casting long, twisted shadows over the trees. The air outside felt heavier now, thicker, like something was closing in. But as the hours ticked by, nothing happened. The woods were still, silent. Eventually, I managed to fall into an uneasy sleep, but it was fitful, full of dreams that made no sense, dreams of glowing eyes in the dark, of being watched from the shadows. When I woke up, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the forest. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It hung in the air like a cloud, lingering just beyond my reach. I spent the next few days and a days constantly on edge. Every time I went outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me, waiting, but I never saw those red eyes again. The woods were quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, that I had been imagining things, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The fear, the tension, the overwhelming feeling of being watched, it was real. And whatever it was that had been out there, it hadn't gone away. It was still waiting. I never went back outside at night after that. The forest, once peaceful and calming, had become a place of dread, a place where the unknown lurked just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. I stayed in the cabin for the remainder of my stay, leaving only during the day when the sun was high and the world seemed a little safer. But every time I glanced at the tree line, I couldn't shake the feeling that those red eyes were still out there, waiting for me to return. I had only been working the night shift at the cemetery for a few weeks when it happened. The job was quiet, monotonous, and mostly uneventful, which is what I liked about it. I was a groundskeeper tasked with patrolling the cemetery, making sure everything was in order and doing some light maintenance. The hours were long, but the pay was decent, and I didn't mind the solitude. It gave me time to think and to be away from the bustle of the world. The cemetery itself was old, not particularly big, but still large enough that walking around it at night could feel like wandering through an endless sea of gravestones. It was the kind of place where the moonlight cast long, eerie shadows across the tombstones, and the trees swayed with an unsettling creak. It wasn't exactly a place you'd want to be after dark, but it was peaceful in its own way, and there wasn't anyone around to bother me. I usually did my rounds at around midnight. It was the perfect time, quiet, cool, and the world felt like it had slowed down to a halt. Most of the time, I'd just drive the old golf cart around the property, making sure the gates were locked, the lights were working, and there weren't any animals or vandals causing trouble. Sometimes I'd sit in the small office, sipping coffee, watching the shadows from the trees dance across the windows. That night, I was particularly tired. I hadn't gotten much sleep the day before, and I felt my eyelids heavy, almost like I could fall asleep standing. I took a long sip of coffee, hoping the caffeine would kick in and keep me alert. The night was unusually still. Not even a breeze stirred in the trees. It was the kind of stillness that made you feel like something was about to happen, like the air was holding its breath. I had just finished a sweep of the far side of the cemetery when I noticed something odd. Near the mausoleum, a small area of the earth had been disturbed. It wasn't much at first, just a few mounds of dirt pushed up, and I thought maybe it was just an animal or the ground shifting. But as I got closer, I realized it was a fresh grave, a recently dug up one, the soil uneven and still soft, like it hadn't settled yet. It was hard to miss, especially in the dim light, the whole looking unnatural in the otherwise peaceful landscape of gravestones. I parked the cart a few feet away and got out, walking toward the hole. It didn't make sense. I had checked the records earlier in the day, and there hadn't been any new graves assigned to that plot. The earth was still dark and moist, freshly turned, and the faint smell of soil and earthworms hung in the air. As I knelt by the edge of the grave, something in my gut twisted. It wasn't just that the grave was out of place, it was the way it had been dug. The edges of the hole were jagged, uneven, as though someone had been in a hurry to get it done. And then, my eyes caught something that made my heart skip a beat. There, in the center of the hole, was a piece of torn clothing half buried in the dirt. My mind raced, trying to piece everything together. Who had done this? And why? I glanced around the cemetery, but everything was still. No signs of movement, no lights flickering in the distance. The area was just as quiet as before, except now there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there moments ago. I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly felt uneasy, like I wasn't supposed to be here. Like I had stumbled into something that wasn't meant for me to see. But I had a job to do. I couldn't just leave it like this. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the grave, hoping I could report it to someone in the morning. But as I zoomed in on the torn piece of clothing, a sudden, sharp sensation ran up my spine. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, the crunching of gravel underfoot. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I quickly turned around, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing there, just the moonlight casting long shadows, the same eerie stillness of the cemetery surrounding me. But the feeling didn't go away. It felt like someone was watching me, like I wasn't alone anymore. I shook my head, trying to calm myself down. I was being paranoid. It was just the silence of the night playing tricks on me, making me hear things. Maybe a raccoon or a stray animal had wandered nearby, making the noise. But then I heard again, more footsteps, this time closer. It was impossible. No one else was supposed to be here. The cemetery was closed at night, and the only people who came after hours were the occasional mourner who didn't respect the rules, but they never made it this far into the cemetery at this time. I quickly turned back toward the grave, scanning the area around me. My eyes landed on a mausoleum a few yards away, its dark, stone face looming in the shadows. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that something was wrong. I was about to walk back to the cart when I felt it, a cold, clammy hand brush lightly against my shoulder. My skin crawled, and every hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. Just empty space. The cemetery stretched out in front of me, the gravestones standing like silent sentinels in the darkness. I scanned the area, feeling my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing, no figure, no shadow, just the cold, unsettling quiet. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was so tired that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the sensation of that cold touch lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Without thinking, I started to walk back toward the cart, my pace quickening. I couldn't stay here any longer. Something wasn't right, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what. My thoughts were racing, and my heart was still pounding in my chest. I just needed to get back to the office, lock the door, and wait until my shift was over. But as I made my way across the cemetery, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Movement. It was by the mausoleum. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I couldn't tell if I had seen it or if it was just my imagination. But there it was again, something moving in the shadows near the mausoleum. Something tall, thin and human-like, but distorted as if it didn't belong. I started backing away, my mind spinning. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't another groundskeeper. I had to get out of there. My heart was racing and my legs were trembling, but I didn't stop moving. I couldn't afford to be here any longer. Just as I turned to head toward the exit, the unmistakable sound of gravel crunching beneath footsteps echoed behind me. This time it was real. I could feel the presence getting closer, and I dared not turn around. I didn't want to know what was behind me. I reached the gate in record time, fumbling for the keys to unlock it. I practically threw myself into the golf cart, slamming the door shut behind me. and I sped out of the cemetery, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was well beyond the gates and out on the main road, where the lights of the town offered some comfort. The rest of my shift felt like a blur. I didn't go back to the cemetery that night. In fact, I didn't return the next night either. I couldn't. The image of the disturbed grave, the footsteps, and that cold, clammy touch haunted me. I reported the grave to the authorities the next day. They came and investigated, but there was no sign of anyone in the area. No footprints, no broken ground, no evidence of a grave being disturbed. It was like nothing had ever happened, but I knew what I had seen, and the feeling of that cold touch on my shoulder still lingered in my mind. As the days passed, the unease faded, but I couldn't shake the memory. Sometimes late at night, when the wind howled through the trees and the cemetery lay under a blanket of moonlight, I would wonder if I was ever truly alone in that place. I set out that morning with the usual anticipation I always feel when hiking alone in remote areas. It's a bit of a ritual for me. No matter how many times I tell myself I should stick to more populated trails, there's something about the quiet, the solitude, that calls to me. The trail I chose this time was far off the beaten path, an old logging route that barely showed on any maps anymore. I had been hiking for hours now, my boots crunching softly on the loose gravel beneath, the trees thickening as the trail twisted deeper into the woods. I had been here before, several times in fact. It was the kind of place where no one else came, a bit overgrown, but not impassable. I could lose myself for hours here without the distractions of modern life, just me and the forest. The further I went, the quieter it seemed. At first, it was peaceful, the birds calling in the trees, the breeze rustling the leaves. But then, after a while, something started to feel off. The air was heavy, almost like it was pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me, though I couldn't see a soul. I shrugged it off, focusing on the path in front of me, trying to ignore the creeping unease that had begun to settle in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't uncommon to feel a bit jumpy in the woods. Your senses heighten when you're alone, and the forest has a way of playing tricks on you. I took a deep breath, pushed it away, and kept moving forward. That was when I heard it. It started as a low sound, something that I could almost mistake for the wind, but it wasn't the wind. It was a laugh, a deep, hollow sound that echoed through the trees. It wasn't a friendly laugh. There was nothing comforting about it. It wasn't the chuckle of someone enjoying the solitude of nature like I was. No, it was something unsettling, like a laugh that belonged to something that shouldn't be here, something unnatural. I stopped immediately, my heart skipping a beat. My eyes darted around, but I couldn't see anything. There was nothing in the woods but trees and the thick underbrush. But the laugh, it wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was close. I froze, listening intently. The laugh came again, this time louder, but still low, almost mocking. It reverberated through the woods, chilling my bones. It sounded distant, yet it was so clear that it was impossible to ignore. A horrible, hollow sound that made my stomach churn. The laugh faded, replaced by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, each step heavy, like it was dragging something behind it. My mind raced, trying to place it. It didn't sound like the usual noises of wildlife, deer, foxes, birds. This was different. This was human, or at least something that mimicked a human. I wasn't sure what to make of it. My first thought was that someone else was out here, but then I realized how odd that was. Who else would be this far off the trail? The nearest access point was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single other hiker all day. Whoever it was, they were deep in the woods with me, and the sound of their footsteps made my blood run cold. I waited, straining my ears to hear anything more. The steps continued, slow but steady, moving in my direction. I swallowed hard. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My gut was telling me to leave, but something inside me was too curious to just run. I wanted to know what it was, who it was. The forest can be full of strange things, but this wasn't right. The next laugh came, even louder than before, sending a shiver down my spine. And then the footsteps picked up speed, though they were still slow. The deliberate pace made my heart race, pounding in my chest. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was getting closer. I glanced behind me, looking down the path, but there was nothing. The trees seemed to close in on me, and the trail ahead was dark and narrow, as if it were swallowing me whole. I couldn't see anything. No figure, no person. But then I heard the snap of a twig. It was close. Too close. My body reacted before my brain could process it. I turned and ran. My boots hit the ground hard as I took off, adrenaline flooding my system. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. The laughter echoed again, almost mocking, as if it was enjoying the panic I felt. The footsteps followed me, still slow, still deliberate. Whoever, or whatever, was chasing me wasn't in a hurry, and that made it worse. It was toying with me. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burn in my legs, focusing only on the path ahead. The trees blurred past, their branches scratching at my arms, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. If I did, I knew I wouldn't be able to keep going. The footsteps seemed to be getting louder, closer. I could hear them clearly now, right behind me, each step sending a wave of terror through me. The trail twisted ahead, and I barely avoided tripping on a root as I scrambled to keep my footing. My legs were starting to feel like lead, my breath coming out in panic gasps, but I didn't dare stop. I had to keep moving. I didn't know what was behind me, but I knew I couldn't face it. And then, just as I thought I might collapse from exhaustion, I stumbled into a small clearing. The trees opened up just enough that I could see the sky above, the light filtering through the branches. It wasn't much, but it felt like safety. For a moment, I allowed myself to slow, my chest heaving with each breath, my eyes scanning the clearing desperately for any sign of movement. I turned around, half expecting to see a figure standing behind me, but the forest was still. The laughter had stopped. The footsteps had faded. There was nothing but the sound of my own breath and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I stood there for a long moment, frozen, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. I had to be. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The sound of the footsteps, the laughter, maybe it was just the forest playing tricks on me. Maybe I had heard an animal or something, and my mind had twisted it into something worse. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I had heard wasn't normal. It wasn't right. I didn't want to stay any longer. I couldn't. I forced myself to take one last look around before I turned and hurried down the path, not bothering to look back again. I kept moving as fast as I could, not stopping to catch my breath, until I finally reached the edge of the forest. As soon as I broke out into the open, I saw my truck parked just up ahead, and it was like a weight lifted off my chest. I didn't care that I was out of breath, that I was exhausted and drenched in sweat. All I cared about was getting out of that place. I didn't stop until I was safely inside the truck, the engine roaring to life as I sped away. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there with me, something that hadn't been human, something that had been watching me the whole time. But whatever it was, it had never caught up with me. I was safe now. As I drove down the winding road, away from the woods, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. But all I saw was the forest, dark and silent. There were no footsteps following me anymore. The laughter was gone, but as the sun set behind the trees, I had a nagging feeling that it wasn't over. Not really. Whatever had been in those woods had followed me. It was out there, still watching, waiting. It was a cold night in the middle of nowhere. I had been driving for hours, the tires humming on the road, the only light coming from my headlights cutting through the dark. The radio was off, and I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The highway stretched out in front of me, flat and empty, with just the occasional curve to break up the monotony. I was on a stretch of road that didn't have any gas stations or towns for miles, just an endless line of asphalt disappearing into the distance. I was tired, but the road had to be conquered. I'd been on this route before. It wasn't the first time I'd driven through it, but tonight there was something different, something I couldn't quite place. The air outside felt heavier, like it had been filled with a thick fog, but there wasn't one. The moonlight barely reached through the windshield, just enough to give the shadows around the road a sharp edge. There was a sense of emptiness that made the silence feel more oppressive than usual. After a few more minutes, I noticed something in my rearview mirror, a set of headlights. They seemed far enough back that they shouldn't have caught my attention, but they were there, shining through the dark. I didn't think much of it first. Maybe it was another car coming up behind me. It didn't seem like a big deal. There were always other drivers out here. I kept my speed steady, and after a few more minutes, I glanced back at the rear view again. The car was closer now. At first, I thought it might be my imagination playing tricks on me. But no, the headlights were much closer than they should have been for a car traveling at the same speed as me. I pressed my foot down a little harder on the gas pedal, hoping to put more distance between me and whoever was behind me. But no matter how fast I drove, the car stayed right there. It was too steady, too constant. I glanced again in the mirror, and this time I could see the outline of the car a little more clearly. It was a dark sedan, nothing too unusual, but it was definitely close. And it wasn't moving like it should have been. It stayed right behind me, no matter how much I accelerated or slowed. I sped up, a little more anxious now, my hands tightening on the wheel. The sound of the engine picking up speed was the only thing that seemed to break through the silence in the car. But the headlights didn't fade. They stayed there, the glare growing stronger and stronger in my mirror, almost blinding me. The road ahead was a long, straight stretch with nothing but blackness in the distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. For the next 10 minutes, I tried everything I could think of. I'd speed up, slow down, try changing lanes, even swerving a little to see if the car would pass me. But it didn't. Every time I tried to shake it off, the car stayed right behind me, its headlights glued to my rear view. The longer it stayed there, the more my heart started to race. I was getting annoyed at first, thinking the person behind me was just some jerk trying to mess with me. But then, the thought crossed my mind. What if they weren't trying to mess with me? What if they were following me on purpose? The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. I quickly glanced over my shoulder, but the dark stretch of highway behind me was empty. There was no sign of another car anywhere in sight, except for the one still riding my tail. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just some random driver out here in the middle of nowhere. Maybe they had somewhere to be too. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. Why would they keep so close? Why wouldn't they just pass me? It wasn't like there were any other cars on the road. I could see the endless stretch of asphalt in front of me, and nothing else seemed to move in the dark. But this car, it wouldn't leave me alone. I glanced at the speedometer. I was going almost 90 miles per hour now, and still, the car stayed behind me like it was right on my tail, keeping pace with every move I made. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just some random driver anymore. Whoever was behind me had been keeping up for far too long for it to be a coincidence. My mind raced with scenarios, none of them good. I took a few deep breaths, trying to stay calm, but I could feel panic creeping in. My mind was clouded with thoughts of someone trying to force me off the road, or even something worse. What if they were trying to trap me? What if I was driving into a situation I couldn't control? I decided to pull off the road and stop. Maybe confronting them would make the situation clearer. If it was just a driver, maybe they'd stop too and we could talk it out. If it was something more sinister, well, I'd cross that bridge when I got to it. I turned on my blinker and slowly started to drift to the side of the road. I had no idea if the car behind me would follow or not. But sure enough, the headlights followed, flickering brighter as they neared. I pulled the car onto the gravel shoulder and came to a stop, hoping that if nothing else, this would force them to either pass me or turn around. I sat there, engine idling, waiting for the car to pull up next to me. My heart was hammering now, a hard pulse in my throat. The headlights loomed closer and closer in my rearview mirror, but they didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. They just stayed there, glaring at me. It felt like the longest few seconds of my life. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to leave, to drive away, but I kept telling myself that this was the only way to get answers. Then, suddenly, the headlights went out. For a second, I was confused. I waited, expecting the car to pull up beside me, but there was nothing, just a thick darkness around me. The glow from my own headlights reflected off the empty road. I waited, holding my breath, but still, nothing happened. The car, the one that had been following me for miles, had vanished. I sat there for a moment, the silence pressing in around me, before I slowly turned my head to look out the side mirror, half expecting to see the car driving past me. But there was no sign of it, not a single car in sight, just an empty stretch of highway stretching off into the night. I had no idea where it had gone or how it had disappeared so quickly. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind ran through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. I had been tailgate for miles, and now, just like that, the car was gone. Vanished. I got out of the car, cautiously looking around, expecting someone to jump out from the darkness. But there was nothing. No movement. No sound. Just the quiet of the night pressing in around me. I climbed back into my car, shaking my head, trying to make sense of it. There was no explanation that made sense. No rational reason why a car would follow me for that long, and then disappear like that. I started the engine again and drove off, this time a lot slower, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again. But I didn't. No more cars, no more headlights, no more sense of being followed. Just the empty road ahead of me, stretching on into the dark. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town that I felt the weight of what had happened fully settle on me. I went straight to a gas station to fill up, my hand still trembling as I pumped gas into the tank. The station attendant was behind the counter, watching me. I could tell she noticed how rattled I was. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone casual but with a hint of concern. I just nodded and forced a smile, not sure how to explain what had just happened. Not sure if I even understood it myself. "Yeah," I said, voice a little shaky. "I'm fine, but I wasn't fine. I didn't feel fine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that something had followed me out there, and it wasn't just a car. It wasn't just some strange coincidence. It was something else, and maybe, just maybe, I'd never really know what it was." We'd been hiking for hours, just the two of us, me and my friend Dan. The sun was still high in the sky, but there was something about the forest that made it feel a little later, like it was about to rain, even though the air was dry and warm. The trail was narrow, lined with trees thick enough that their canopies blocked out much of the sky. We were deep into the woods, far from any kind of road or campsite. It was peaceful in a way that was almost too quiet, the only sounds coming from our boots, crunching on the dirt, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. We'd been here before, but this time, something felt off. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was the way the trees seemed to stand just a little too close together, their dark branches bending over us like a canopy of heavy shadows. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Dan, usually the more talkative of the two of us, hadn't said much in the past hour. I glanced over at him as we continued down the trail. He was walking a little faster than usual, his eyes scanning the trees ahead of him, his brow furrowed like he was thinking hard about something. I couldn't help but wonder if he felt it too, the unease that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. We paused for a break, sitting on a fallen log and taking a swig from our water bottles. I pulled out a granola bar, and we ate in silence, both of us distracted by the silence of the forest around us. There wasn't even the usual chirping of birds or rustling of small animals. It was just quiet. That's when we heard it. At first, it was barely a whisper, a soft sound that might have been the wind or just our imaginations. But then, it came again, clearer this time. A woman's voice, singing. It wasn't like any song I'd ever heard before. The melody was sweet but eerie, as if it had been carried on the wind for miles, and the words. I couldn't make them out, but they had a strange cadence to them. It almost sounded like the voice was calling to us, beckoning us deeper into the woods. There was something about it that didn't feel right, but at the same time, it drew us in, like a moth to a flame. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dan's eyes flicked over to me, his face pale. "Yeah, what is that?" I didn't know. I looked around, trying to place the sound. It was coming from deeper in the woods, but I couldn't tell exactly where. The trees all looked the same, the shadows long and dark between them. "We should check it out," Dan said, his voice almost like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "Maybe it's just someone else out here, lost or something." I didn't know if I wanted to find out, but something about the voice made me want to follow it. So, against my better judgment, I nodded. We grabbed our backpacks and started walking toward the sound. The singing grew louder as we moved, each step taking us further away from the trail and deeper into the forest. The further we went, the stranger the woods seemed. The trees were thicker, their trunks twisted in odd shapes, like they'd been growing for centuries without seeing sunlight. The underbrush was dense, the ground soft and spongy under our boots. The air felt heavier too, thick with the smell of damp earth and moss. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. The voice continued to sing, its sweet melody filling the air, but it was still so far away. The song had no rhythm, no clear structure, just a haunting, lilting sound that seemed to echo off the trees. It was almost like it was coming from all directions at once, surrounding us in a way that made it hard to tell where it was really coming from. We walked for what felt like an hour, our feet crunching through the forest floor, but we never seemed to get any closer to the source of the singing. It was as if the voice was just out of reach, teasing us, pulling us deeper into the woods. Eventually, we stopped. My legs were starting to ache from the constant movement, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest, thumping hard in my ears. Dan looked just as uneasy as I felt. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his eyes darting nervously around the trees. This is getting weird," he said, his voice shaky. "I know," I replied, "but we're close. I can feel it. We just need to keep going a little longer." But even as I said it, I knew something was wrong. The air was too still, too heavy. The song was still there, but it had changed somehow. It didn't feel inviting anymore. It felt more like a warning to turn around, to leave before it was too late. We kept going, but then, without any warning, the singing stopped. 1 second, it was there, haunting and beautiful, and the next, it was gone. The sudden silence was deafening. It felt like the entire forest had exhaled, releasing the tension that had been building up all around us. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I looked at Dan, who was just as wide-eyed as I was. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice low. I didn't know what to say. The silence felt wrong, like we were missing something important. The woods around us felt empty now, like all the life had drained away. It was as if the song had been the only thing keeping the forest alive, and now that it had stopped, everything was hollow. We stood there for a moment, listening to the complete stillness. Nothing, not even the wind, was moving. Then, in the distance, I heard something. A snap of a twig, a movement in the underbrush. I turned to Dan. "We need to go. Now." Without waiting for him to respond, I started to turn back the way we'd come. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs felt like they were moving on their own. Dan didn't argue. He was already following behind me, his footsteps quick and hurried. But the woods seemed different now. The trail wasn't where it had been, and the trees were closing in around us. The way we'd come had changed, like the forest was shifting, making it harder for us to find our way back. Every direction looked the same, and every path we tried seemed to lead us deeper into the forest, further away from where we thought the trail should be. The panic started to set in. I glanced over at Dan, who was breathing heavily, his face pale. "Where's the trail?" I asked, my voice tight with fear. "I don't know," he replied, his voice shaking. "I thought it was just back there. We have to keep moving. Don't stop." We pushed on, but the further we went, the more disoriented we became. The trees seemed to be watching us now, their twisted branches like fingers reaching out, blocking our way. The air felt colder, the light dimmer. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on us, like something was waiting for us to make a mistake. And then I heard again, the song. The same haunting melody, soft and sweet, drifting through the trees. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It was coming from just ahead of us, but it sounded different this time. Faint, fading. "Do you hear it?" Dan whispered, his voice tight with fear. I nodded. "Yeah, it's close." We followed the sound, desperate now, moving faster than before. But as we pushed through the underbrush, the the song stopped once more. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. Where the hell is it coming from? Dan grabbed my arm. We need to get out. This isn't right. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. We both knew it was time to leave. We turned and ran. This time, there was no hesitation. No slowing down. We just ran, our legs burning as we pushed through the forest, weaving between trees, not caring about anything except getting out of there. We didn't stop until we reached the trail. When we did, we both collapsed onto the ground, panting and covered in sweat. The air felt different now, easier to breathe, lighter. We were back on solid ground, where we could hear the sounds of the world around us once again. We didn't say anything for a long time. Neither of us knew what to say. There was no explanation for what we had just experienced, no logical reason for the voice or the way the forest had shifted around us. But one thing was clear, we were never going back. I had been camping alone in a remote part of the forest for 2 nights, something I had done many times before. I'd picked this spot because it was far from the main trails, deep enough into the woods that I knew there wouldn't be any hikers or campers nearby. It was the kind of place where the trees grow so thick that the sky barely peeks through, and the sounds of civilization are long gone, leaving only the whispers of the forest around you. The solitude was exactly what I needed after a stressful few months at work. The first day had been peaceful. The sun filtered through the canopy in warm beams as I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and enjoyed the quiet stillness. I spent the afternoon hiking along a nearby creek, the sound of water trickling over rocks providing a constant companion to my thoughts. That evening, as the sun set, I cooked my dinner over a small campfire, the crackling with a familiar, comforting sound. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. The air grew colder, the shadows stretching longer than they should have, and I noticed that the usual sounds of the forest seemed to fade. The wind, which had been gently rustling the leaves, had died down. The insects, which usually buzzed and hummed in the evening, had fallen completely silent. Even the birds, which would occasionally chirp from the trees, had ceased their calls. The silence was oppressive, like the whole forest had stopped breathing. I couldn't explain it, but it made me uneasy. It wasn't something I had encountered before. Normally, the woods are alive with sound, even in the dead of night. But here now, everything felt wrong. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to shake off the feeling. The shadows around me grew darker, and despite the warmth of the fire, I felt a chill creep up my spine. I decided to go to bed early that night. I unzipped the tent, crawled in, and zipped it shut behind me. The inside of the tent smelled faintly of campfire smoke, and I could hear the occasional creak of tree branches swaying in the wind. But everything was too quiet, even inside the tent. I tried to fall asleep, but the silence outside kept me awake. I kept listening for something, anything, but there was nothing. No rustling leaves, no animal sounds, just the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the fabric of the tent above me, but eventually I drifted off to sleep, though it was restless. I was awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of something scraping against the side of my tent. It wasn't the usual sound of wind or animals. It was something deliberate, like nails dragging slowly across the canvas. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The scraping continued, moving along the tent, stopping at one point, then starting again. I held my breath, listening intently. Was it an animal? A bear? A raccoon? No, it was too deliberate. I reached for my flashlight, but it was too far away, lying just outside the reach of my sleeping bag. I debated whether I should make a run for it and grab it, but I didn't want to risk drawing attention to myself if whatever it was still out there. The scraping stopped, but I could still hear something moving outside. A soft shuffle, then silence again. I waited, counting the seconds. When nothing moved after a while, I slowly exhaled, trying to calm myself down. I didn't sleep again that night. Instead, I lay there, staring at the tent wall, listening for anything else that might happen. But nothing came, just the silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of the tent and the slight breeze that had returned sometime after the scraping stopped. When the first light of dawn finally began to filter through the trees, I wasted no time packing up. I wasn't sure what had happened during the night, but the unease in my gut told me it wasn't something I should ignore. I had camped out in remote places many times, and while I had certainly encountered some strange noises and unsettling moments, this felt different. It felt deliberate. I moved quickly, breaking down my campsite and preparing to head out. The forest still felt unnervingly quiet. The birds were still silent, and the air had that heavy stillness to it. I barely stopped to take a breath, eager to get back to the car and leave the strange feeling behind. That was when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. My eyes scanned the trees, looking for the familiar trail leading out of the forest. But then I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. My heart skipped a beat and my body went rigid. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, and it stood perfectly still. It was facing me, or at least I assumed it was, though I couldn't make out any details of its face. The figure was almost entirely obscured by the trees, but there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was standing there just beyond the line where the trees thinned out. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as the figure didn't move. Not even a twitch. I stared at it, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be another camper? No, I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and this part of the forest was far from any marked path. The seconds stretched on, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was too still, too silent. A person wouldn't stand like that for so long, without moving, without reacting. There was something wrong about it. The figure was wearing dark clothing, but it was hard to see details in the dim morning light. Its body seemed to blend with the shadows, as though it belonged to the forest itself. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I had been in dangerous situations before, and my body had always known how to react, but this felt different. This felt like it was more than just danger. It felt like something that didn't belong in the world I knew. Then, the figure took a step forward. The movement was slow and deliberate, and my stomach churned. I was suddenly aware of how exposed I was. There was no way to hide, no way to run without being seen. The trail behind me was narrow, winding, and it would take too long to reach my car. I was trapped. The figure took another step, then another. I snapped into motion. Without thinking, I grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulder, and bolted down the trail. My legs moved on autopilot, pushing me forward through the thick underbrush and narrow path. I didn't look back, not even once, as I heard the sound of twigs snapping underfoot, the unmistakable sound of someone moving after me. I ran faster, my breath ragged, my mind a blur. I had no plan, no idea where I was going, only the desperate need to get away. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees narrowing the path, forcing me to push harder to escape. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, but I refused to slow down. I could hear the breath in my ears, feel the pounding of my heart in my chest, each step bringing me closer to whatever it was that was following me. The trail finally began to widen, and I saw the break in the trees ahead. My heart leapt to my chest. My car was just a few hundred yards away, and I could see the clearing where the trail opened up to the parking lot. With every ounce of strength left in me, I pushed myself harder, and then, just as I reached the edge of the clearing, I heard the footsteps stop. I didn't dare look back. I didn't even want to acknowledge it. I didn't want to know if whatever had been following me was still there. I stumbled through the clearing, eyes locked on my car. As soon as I reached the driver's side door, I threw it open, jumped inside, and slammed it shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and I didn't even wait to check the rearview mirror before pulling out of the lot and speeding down the dirt road that led out of the forest. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the highway, far away from the woods. Only then did I feel my breath slow, my heartbeat return to normal, and the weight of what had happened sink in. I never went back to that part of the forest. Not once. And to this day, I don't know who or what that figure was. But I know one thing for sure. It wasn't human, and and it wasn't something I ever want to encounter again. I had been hiking alone for a few days, taking in the solitude and the fresh air of the woods. The trail I was following was familiar, though there were parts of it that always made me feel a little uneasy. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to close in around me at times, or how the shadows grew longer as I made my way deeper into the wilderness. But I always pushed that feeling aside, chalking it up to the natural isolation of hiking alone. It wasn't until I noticed a trail marker that things started to feel different. The day had been long, and the sun was starting to dip low in the sky. I had planned to make camp before it got dark, but I was still a few miles away from my destination. I wasn't rushing, but I did want to get a good spot before the light was completely gone. The trail was quiet. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call. It was peaceful, but that peace never lasted long for me when I was alone in the woods. That's when I saw the trail marker. It was just a simple wooden post with a few faded markings. I had passed hundreds like on my hike, but something about this one seemed off. The arrow pointing forward was slightly tilted, and the paint that marked the trail was uneven. It looked as though someone had tried to scrape off the original arrow and repaint it, but didn't quite manage it. The paint was fresh, still tacky in places. It looked too new, too deliberate. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a pang of unease. I stopped for a moment, staring at the marker. It wasn't anything too obvious, but the altered marker felt wrong. It felt like someone had done it on purpose. Maybe it was an attempt to confuse hikers, or maybe there was something else behind it. It made my skin crawl, the thought that someone might have intentionally left a misleading marker on the trail. I should have turned around then, but I didn't. Something told me to keep going, to push through whatever weird feeling had settled in my stomach. I continued on, trying to shake the feeling of unease, but it only grew worse with every step. The air felt thicker, like it was harder to breathe. I kept thinking about the marker, about who might have changed it and why. I kept my pace steady, but my eyes kept darting back toward the trees, looking for anything out of place. The sun was dipping lower now, and I had to start thinking about where I'd camp for the night. As the lights started to fade, I reached a small clearing that seemed as good a place as any to set up camp. I quickly set up my tent, trying to stay focused. I tried to ignore the creeping unease, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The wind had picked up, and the trees were swaying gently. The sounds of the forest seemed to quiet as the night set in, leaving just the occasional rustle of leaves. I made a small fire, cooking a simple meal as I sat by the flames. The crackling of the fire was comforting, but it didn't completely push away the feeling that something was wrong. My mind kept wandering back to the trail marker, to that sense of being watched. I'd never been one to overthink things like this, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept checking my surroundings, scanning the tree line for any signs of movement, but there was nothing. Just the wind, the trees, and the fire. It wasn't until after I'd finished eating that I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, the way it moved through the trees. But then I heard it again. My name. A whisper, but clear enough to make out. It was faint, but it sent a chill through me. I sat frozen for a moment, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't sure if I'd actually heard it, if it was just my mind playing tricks on me in the dark, but then I heard it again. Asterisk, hey? Asterisk. The whisper was soft, but it sounded unmistakably like my name. I stood up quickly, scanning the darkness. My mind was racing. It couldn't be anyone, not out here. I was miles from the nearest trailhead, and the only people I had seen the past few days were a couple of hikers who had passed me on the trail. I was sure I hadn't heard anyone come near my camp. Still, the whisper was unmistakable. Someone was out there. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking as I flicked it on. I pointed it toward the trees, moving slowly around the campfire. The beam of light bounced off the trunks, catching nothing but shadows and the occasional fluttering of leaves. My pulse quickened. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Asterisk, hey? Asterisk again, the voice closer this time. It felt like it was coming from just beyond the light of the fire. I felt a wave of panic crash over me. I knew I had to stay calm, but the fear was overwhelming. Someone was out there. But who? Why would they be calling my name? I couldn't think straight. The only thing I could think of was to get out of there. I grabbed my pack, stuffing everything inside as quickly as I could. My mind was racing, trying to process everything at once, but I couldn't. I couldn't focus. I needed to get out of there, and fast. I turned off the fire, plunging the camp into darkness. My flashlight barely illuminated the path as I quickly made my way toward the trail. The whispering had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that had been waiting in the dark. My breath was ragged as I pushed forward, trying to keep my composure, but every step felt like an eternity. I kept hearing noises behind me, twigs snapping in the underbrush. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing. Still, the feeling of being hunted, of being stalked, was overwhelming. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get back to my car, to get away from whatever was out there. I stumbled along the trail, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as I tried to move faster. My thoughts were a blur, my fear taking over. I kept expecting to hear that whisper again, but it never came. Just the sound of my own breathing and the rush of my footsteps. The woods were unnervingly quiet, the only sound the crunch of my boots on the trail. I had no idea how long I walked, but eventually I came to a familiar part of the trail, a rocky outcrop I had passed earlier in the day. My heart sank. I was almost back at camp, but I had gone in the wrong direction. I had been walking in circles. The realization hit me like a cold slap to the face. I had been so consumed by fear, I hadn't even been paying attention to the trail. I felt like an idiot. I froze, standing in the dark, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I had to get back. I couldn't stay here. I turned around and retraced my steps, walking quickly but carefully this time. My heart was still pounding, but I forced myself to focus on the trail markers, the path, anything that would keep me grounded. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, though. It lingered like a shadow hanging over me, but I refused to let it stop me. I finally made it back to my camp, though it didn't feel like relief. The fire had long since burned out, and the night had grown colder. I stood at the edge of the clearing, unsure of what to do. I couldn't stay here, but I also couldn't leave. Something didn't feel right. The woods had gone silent, eerily so, as though holding their breath. I packed up the rest of my gear, my hands still shaking. I didn't want to be out there anymore. I couldn't explain it, but something had shifted. The woods weren't just quiet. They were still, unnaturally still. I felt like I was the only thing moving in a world that had frozen in place. I left without looking back, walking as quickly as I could without running, until I reached the trailhead. My car was parked in a lot, and I got in without a second thought. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing there. There was nothing, just the empty road stretching behind me. I didn't go back to that trail. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't think anyone would believe me. Sometimes, though, when I think back on it, I wonder who altered that trail marker and why they left me with that strange, unshakable feeling of being watched. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week-long solo camping trip in the Adirondacks was just what I needed. There's something about the woods up there that always brings me peace. I've been camping in the Adirondacks before, so I was familiar with the area. I'd done my research, picked a secluded spot, and set up my tent. It was just me, the trees, and the quiet. I arrived at the site late in the afternoon, the kind of late where the sun's beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretch over the forest floor. I wasn't too worried about being alone. After all, I had camped alone before, and I knew the drill. There were no other campsites nearby, and I liked it that way. A little solitude was always good for clearing my mind. After setting up my tent and unpacking my gear, I made a small fire, cooked up some dinner, and settled in for a peaceful evening. The night sky was crisp and clear, with a million stars twinkling overhead. The crackling of the fire was the only sound besides the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I stretched out on my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of my tent. The fabric seemed to creak and stretch with the slight breeze, but I didn't think much of it. Eventually, the sound of the fire dying down lulled me to sleep. I woke in the middle of the night. It wasn't anything in particular that woke me, just the feeling that something wasn't right. I opened my eyes and blinked into the darkness. My eyes slowly adjusted, and I could just make out the outline of the tent walls and the dim light filtering through the mesh. Everything seemed normal. Nothing was out of place. Still, that uneasy feeling lingered. I tried to shake it off and close my eyes again, telling myself it was nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. It was as if the air around me had shifted, become heavier. My breath seemed louder in my ears, the sound of it almost too much for the silence. I lay there, wide awake, for what felt like forever, listening to the quiet hum of the forest. That's when I heard it, a slight rustling outside my tent. I froze, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. The sound was so faint, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. Maybe it was an animal, a deer, or maybe even a raccoon rummaging around. That's what I told myself anyway. But then the rustling grew louder. It was closer now. I held my breath, trying to listen. The air felt thick with tension. I stayed still, waiting. Another noise, this time a slow, deliberate crunching of leaves. Someone was out there, just outside my tent. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and my hand were cold with fear. There was no mistaking it now. Someone, or something, was moving around outside. I glanced at the zipper of the tent, wondering if I should peek out and see who it was. But that thought terrified me more than anything. What if I saw someone? What if they saw me? I laid there, staring at the dark canvas above me, my pulse racing. The crunching of leaves stopped, and I thought, maybe, just maybe, it was an animal after all. But then in the stillness of the night, I heard something else, something that made my blood run cold. A faint tapping on the side of my tent. Not a bang, but a light, almost curious tap. Whoever, or whatever, was outside had come closer. They were standing right beside me. I could feel my breath hitching in my throat, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My mind raced with thoughts I couldn't control. What if it was someone looking to rob me? Or worse, I hadn't heard anyone pass by earlier in the day, and there wasn't anyone else camping this far out. I was alone, completely alone. The tapping continued, soft, almost tentative, but unmistakable. It was as if whoever was out there was testing the tent, as if they were trying to gauge how close they could get before I noticed them. I stayed as still as I could, praying that they would go away, that it was all just some trick of the wind or a random animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The silence after the tapping felt suffocating. My ears rang with the absence of sound. Then, just when I thought I couldn't stand it anymore, I heard something I hadn't expected. A slow, deliberate breath. Not a wind gust, not the trees swaying. This was a human breath. The breath was so close. Right outside my tent. I could hear the intake, the exhale, heavy and slow, like someone was standing there just watching me. I felt my throat close up. My body was rigid, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I didn't move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. It felt like hours, though I knew it could only have been minutes. My mind spun through every worst-case scenario. I thought of grabbing my knife from my pack, but I didn't want to make any noise. I didn't want to alert the person to the fact that I was awake. And then, as if the tension had reached its peak, I heard it, footsteps, moving away from the tent, back into the woods. Slowly at first, then with more confidence. They were walking away. My chest was heaving now, the air in the tent suddenly too thick. I lay there, still as stone, trying to process what had just happened. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out there. Whoever it was hadn't meant to leave. They had watched me for a reason. And now, they were walking off into the woods, leaving me with nothing but the eerie echo of their footsteps in the night. I stayed perfectly still, listening to the silence that followed. After what felt like forever, I finally moved, reaching for my flashlight and checking the zipper on the tent. Everything looked fine. No holes, no signs of anyone trying to get in. But my mind wasn't fooled. That tapping, the breath, wasn't just a mistake. Someone had been out there. I couldn't stay. Not after that. I grabbed my things, my hands trembling as I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I was shaking all over, my legs weak as I struggled to pull my tent down. The thought of staying there for one more minute made my skin crawl. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I threw everything into my pack, barely able to zip it closed, and I started walking. I didn't look back. My mind kept racing, replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of it. But there was no sense to be made. A person had stood there outside my tent, watching me, and then they had just walked away. The walk back to my car was long, though it felt like it went by in a blur. My eyes kept darting around the trees, convinced I was being watched. The whole forest seemed different now, dark and unfamiliar. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump. My hand was shaking so much I could barely hold the flashlight, and my breathing was shallow. When I finally reached the parking lot, I didn't stop to look around. I tossed my gear into the trunk of my car, slammed it shut, and drove off without a second thought. The rest of the drive home was a blur of white-knuckled gripping on the steering wheel, eyes darting to every corner of the road. The calm of the forest had disappeared, replaced by a lingering unease that wouldn't let go. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not at first. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. But one thing was for sure, I wasn't going back to that site, and I'd never camp alone again. As I pulled in my driveway, the sun was just beginning to rise, but it did little to ease the dread I felt. That night in the Adirondacks had been the last time I'd ever camp alone in the woods. And I knew deep down there would always be something in those trees, something I would never be able to explain. I've been hiking for years, but the Cascades were different. The mountains were steep, thick with trees, and you could feel the wilderness pressing in around you. It was the kind of place where you could be miles away from anyone and just be. The air was crisp, but still thick with that fresh, damp scent of the forest floor. I was alone that day, which was just how I liked it. I was used to being on my own, especially when I was out in nature. It wasn't a particularly difficult section of trail I was on, but I was deep into the Cascades now, far from the bustling day hikers, away from the tourist spots. The trail wound through dense trees, and the ground was a mix of loose dirt, rocks, and the occasional patch of roots. The further I hiked, the quieter it became, the kind of silence that gets into your bones. Only the occasional bird or squirrel disturbed the peace. As I rounded a corner in the trail, I came across another hiker. It was the usual brief moment where you pass someone else on the trail. We exchanged a quick, casual, "Hey," as we went by each other. There wasn't anything odd about them, just a guy in his late 20s or early 30s, wearing a typical hiking outfit, carrying a pack. He didn't look like he was struggling or in distress. Just a regular hiker on the trail. We passed by, and I kept going without giving it much thought. But then a few minutes later, as I made another turn in the trail, something caught my eye. A pack. Not far from where the trail curved, it was lying on the ground, right in the middle of the path. At first, I didn't think much of it. I've seen plenty of packs left behind, especially by day hikers who decided to rest for a second or maybe got distracted. What caught my attention next, though, was the water bottle. It was sitting there right next to the pack, tipped over, with a little bit of water pulled around it. That's when I started feeling that weird pull at the back of my mind, the little tickle of unease. I stopped and looked around. It was strange. There was no sign of the hiker anywhere, and I just passed him a few minutes ago. I called out, "Hey, you okay?" The words felt thin in the air, like they didn't belong in the silence of the forest. No response. I stepped closer, crouching down to get a better look at the pack. It was a standard hiking bag, nothing special, black with a few zippers and straps hanging loosely. The water bottle was one of those insulated ones, slightly dinged up. I hesitated for a moment. Maybe they just stepped off the trail for a quick break. Maybe they were ahead of me and had stopped somewhere farther along. I wasn't about to just leave their stuff lying around. I called out again, "Hello." There was still nothing. The silence seemed louder now. Somehow, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I started to feel a little more uneasy. Something wasn't right. I took a quick look around, scanning the area. The trail was narrow, thick with trees and underbrush, but still there was no sign of anyone. No sounds of movement, no voices, nothing. I looked back at the pack. Maybe they just made a quick stop and would be back any second. I almost convinced myself of that. But then my eyes went back to the water bottle, and that little detail started gnawing at me. It was tipped over, not like it had been carelessly dropped, but like it had been intentionally placed that way. I frowned and glanced around once more, tried to shake off the feeling that something was off. I started walking down the trail a little ways, hoping to catch up, maybe find a hiker just around the bend. But the trail kept winding, and I kept walking. The more I walked, the more I realized how quiet it had gotten. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling in the trees, not even the usual chattering of squirrels. It felt like everything had gone still, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I turned back around, determined to look a little more carefully for any signs of the hiker. Maybe they just decided to go off the trail for a few minutes and hadn't bothered to pack everything back up. It was common enough. Still, the uneasy feeling kept growing. I called out again, "Hey, where are you?" But there was still nothing. The pack was still there, untouched, sitting in the middle of the path. I reached down and picked it up. It felt heavier than I expected, though it wasn't too heavy. I zipped it open, half expecting to find something to explain where the hiker had gone, some clue. Maybe they'd left in a hurry. But all I found was a small first aid kit, a few granola bars, and some maps. Nothing that seemed like it would explain why the hiker had just disappeared. By now, I was getting nervous. I've been on enough trails to know that things don't usually go that wrong without a reason. People don't just vanish, especially out here where the trail is the only way in or out. And yet, there I was, holding someone's pack in the middle of the trail with no sign of the person who had been carrying it just minutes ago. I decided to go back to the last bend where I'd seen the hiker. Maybe I could retrace their steps and find something. I walked quickly, scanning the trees and the trail, trying to make sense of it. I went back through the corner we'd both passed, then continued forward. Nothing. I stopped again and listened. There was no sound except the occasional rustling of leaves high in the trees. The quiet was unnerving. I looked back at the spot where I'd found the pack. Something was wrong. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, but I couldn't explain why. I wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but this was starting to feel different. I walked farther down the trail, the pack still in my hands, hoping to see something that would make sense of it all. The deeper I went, the more unsettled I became. The quiet was suffocating, and I realized how much I was relying on the sound of my footsteps just to reassure myself I wasn't alone. After a while, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That thought alone made my heart rate spike. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone just standing there in the trees, watching me. But there was nothing. Nothing but the trees and the empty trail. I turned back again, and it was then that I realized what had been bugging me. The water bottle. I don't know why it hit me, but it suddenly seemed wrong. I had left it behind when I grabbed the pack, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized something wasn't right. It wasn't like the water bottle was just forgotten. It had been carefully set down, tipped over with precision. That's when I knew something had gone wrong. I started hurrying back toward the pack, now feeling an uncomfortable tension crawling through my chest. My heart thudded loudly in my ears as I retraced my steps, my mind spinning with possibilities. What if the hiker had been injured? What if they needed help and I hadn't been quick enough? Maybe they were hiding somewhere on the trail, trying to stay out of sight. The thought made my stomach twist. I wasn't about to let them go missing without at least trying to find them. When I reached the pack again, I set it back down on the trail. I stood there for a moment, trying to figure out my next move. Should I keep going? Maybe it was nothing, just some random hiker who'd taken a detour. But my gut told me it was more than that. I had this creeping feeling that something had happened, something I wasn't seeing. I made the decision to keep going a little farther. I called out once more, but there was no answer. I could feel the tension growing with every step. There was something I wasn't understanding, something that didn't make sense. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely noticeable, but there. A crack of a twig in the distance. The unmistakable sound of someone moving. My head jerked around. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Nothing but the wind pushing through the trees and the shadows growing longer as the day slipped toward evening. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to find anything if I let fear control me. I turned and started back down the trail, moving faster now, walking through the thickening trees with the feeling of being watched weighing heavily on me. When I finally reached the parking lot hours later, I still hadn't seen another soul. No sign of the hiker, no clues, nothing that explained what had happened. Their pack had remained on the trail, abandoned, like they had just vanished. I still don't know what happened to them. Maybe they got hurt and had to leave, or maybe they had just taken a detour and I didn't see where they went. But all I know for sure is that when I left that trail, the hiker was gone. Their pack was left behind, and I never saw them again. I woke up suddenly, my eyes snapping open to the stillness of the room. It was dark, pitch black, except for the faint sliver of moonlight that crept through the blinds. My mind was groggy, caught in that half-wakefulness that comes from being yanked out of a deep sleep. I shifted in bed, the cool sheets sliding across my skin. I was about to settle back in when I saw it. A figure, standing at the foot of the bed. My heart stopped, a jolt of panic shooting through me. For a moment, I thought it was my husband. He sometimes got up late for water or to check on something, and I wasn't used to being awake in the middle of the night, so my brain didn't connect the dots right away. I squinted, trying to make out the details of the figure in the near darkness. My husband wasn't the tallest guy, but this figure was much taller than him. It didn't make sense. I lay perfectly still, trying to breathe quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dark, and that's when the unease settled into my stomach. Something about the figure didn't feel right. It wasn't the shape of a person. It didn't have the familiar outlines I expected to see. It was like the silhouette of a man, but distorted. The head was too large, too wide, and the body too long. The legs looked almost unnatural, as if they were stretched out too far to fit into the proportions of a normal person. A chill ran down my spine. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, thinking I was just seeing things in my groggy state. I looked again, but the figure didn't change. It was still there, standing completely still at the foot of the bed. There was no movement, no sound, just a presence. I could feel it. I wanted to call out, but my voice was frozen in my throat, swallowed by the silence of the room. I could feel my pulse hammering in my neck, my breath shallow and fast, like a panicked animal trapped in the dark. I forced myself to look around, to see if there was anything else, any other explanation. My husband was still lying beside me, his chest rising and falling slowly, his face peaceful in sleep. I could see his soft, even breaths, could hear them faintly in the otherwise dead silence. That should have reassured me. It should have, but it didn't. The figure was still there, and I couldn't take my eyes off it. I wanted to scream, to jump up, to grab my phone and call for help, but I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, locked in place by the terror that had rooted itself in my chest. I couldn't look away from the figure at the foot of my bed. It wasn't doing anything, it was just standing there. But the longer I stared at it, the more I began to feel a sense of dread, an overwhelming, deep-rooted fear that I couldn't explain. I blinked again, and that's when it happened. In the split second my eyelids closed, the figure was gone, vanished. There wasn't even a trace left behind, no rustle of clothing, no movement of the air to suggest it had even been there. Just gone. I lay there, staring into the darkness, my mind racing. What just happened? Had I imagined it? I couldn't be sure, but I could still feel the lingering fear, the tightness in my chest, the feeling that something wasn't right. I turned to look at my husband, his face still peaceful in sleep, the sheets still rising and falling with each steady breath. It made no sense. How could he not have heard or seen anything? I lay back down, my mind trying to justify what had just occurred. Maybe I'd been dreaming, I told myself. Maybe I had just woken up out of a deep sleep, and my mind was still half in that dream state. But as much as I tried to reason with myself, something inside me knew that it wasn't just a dream. It felt real, too real. I closed my eyes again, hoping to fall back asleep, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept replaying the image of the figure standing there. Its distorted form burned into my memory. I had to shake myself out of it, but every time I tried to think of something else, my mind snapped back to that image. I tried to calm my breathing, slow my pulse, but the fear was still there. I don't know how long I lay there in the dark, caught between the pull of sleep and the nagging fear that something wasn't right. I tried to focus on the sounds of the house, the creaking of the floorboards, the low hum of the fridge in the kitchen, but it didn't help. The silence was deafening. Every little noise felt too loud. Every creak of the house felt like it was magnified tenfold. And then, just when I thought I might lose my mind from the tension, the sound of my husband's voice cut through the silence. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice thick with sleep. I turned to look at him, startled. He had his eyes still closed, his face relaxed, like he hadn't been awake at all. "Yeah," I whispered back, my voice shaky. "I'm fine. Just had a weird dream." He shifted in bed, turning toward me slightly, as though sensing that something wasn't quite right. "What's wrong? You seem tense," he said, his voice still soft. I didn't want to tell him. I didn't want to sound crazy. I didn't want to say that I had seen something standing at the foot of the bed, something that shouldn't have been there. He would think I was losing it. Instead, I just shrugged and rolled over, turning my back to him, hoping that sleep would come and that this weird moment would fade into the night. But it didn't. The feeling of unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I kept my eyes closed, pretending to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. I heard my husband's breathing slow again as he drifted back to sleep, the sound soft and steady. The house creaked in the distance, and the clock on the nightstand ticked away the seconds, but nothing felt right. I kept thinking about that figure, wondering if it had really been there at all. My mind wouldn't let it go. After a long while, I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, the fear still hanging in the air like a thick fog. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke again, it was to the first light of dawn creeping through the blinds, spilling a soft glow into the room. The fear had faded by then, replaced by the dull heaviness of morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong. As the day wore on, I told myself it was just my imagination, that it had been a trick of the light, a product of being half awake. Maybe I'd been dreaming. Maybe it had been nothing more than a fragment of some lingering nightmare. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew what I had seen. And yet, there was something even more unsettling. Something I couldn't shake. I never mentioned it to my husband. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. But that night, as I lay in bed again, I couldn't help but glance at the foot of the bed before I closed my eyes, half expecting to see that figure again. But there was nothing, just a quiet, peaceful room, and a strange, lingering sense that I wasn't alone. I've never been the type to scare easily, especially in the woods. Growing up, my family did a lot of camping. My dad had a small pickup truck, and we'd load it with all our gear, tents, sleeping bags, a propane stove, and the cooler filled with food, and head off to some remote spot for the weekend. Usually it was just us, sometimes a few other families. It wasn't anything fancy, just a place to get away from the noise of the world. There was always something calming about being surrounded by trees, a crackling campfire, and the occasional howl of a distant coyote. But that night, everything changed. We had set up camp near the edge of a thick forest, one of our favorite spots. It was a quiet, peaceful place, no other campers in sight. The only sound that night was the gentle rustle of the leaves as the wind passed through the trees. My little sister, Kelly, was playing around the campfire with her stuffed bear, laughing as Dad told us stories about his days as a young camper. It was a typical night, and I remember feeling completely at ease, like nothing could go wrong. But then, just as the sky had begun to darken, something cut through the calm. A child cry. At first, I thought it was Kelly. I turned to look at her, but she was still sitting next to Dad, poking at the fire with a stick, completely unbothered. The cry came again, louder this time, more desperate. It wasn't Kelly, and it didn't sound like any child I recognized. My stomach tightened. It was faint but unmistakable. The kind of cry you hear in the middle of the night when a child is scared, lost, or hurt. I glanced at my parents. Dad was still talking, but I could see a flicker of confusion in his eyes as he paused mid-sentence. Mom's expression was more tense, like she was listening too. "Did you hear that?" I asked, even though I knew they had. Dad squinted into the dark woods. I don't know. Maybe some animal. I don't think so, I said. It sounded like a kid. The second cry rang out again, this time almost right on top of us. It felt like it was right next to our campsite. My heart started to race. No animals I knew of made that kind of sound, especially not in the middle of the night. That wasn't the sound of an animal in pain. It was the cry of a child, raw and filled with distress. Stay here, Dad said, finally standing up. I'll go check it out. But the look in his eyes told me he was uncertain too. I could tell he didn't want to go, but he had to. It was the responsible thing to do. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and stood up too. My parents exchanged a quick glance. Neither of them said anything, but it was clear they both felt the same unease. I was only 15, but I've been on enough camping trips to know that when something feels wrong in the woods, it usually is. Without thinking, I followed Dad as he headed toward the tree line. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, but it didn't reveal anything except the dark trunks of trees and thick underbrush. Stay close, Dad ordered, his voice low. We moved toward the sound, and with every step, it grew fainter. The more we walked, the farther away it seemed. It was almost as if the child, if it even was a child, was moving away from us. I was starting to feel the coldness of the night settling in, the kind of cold that creeps under your skin and makes your senses heighten. The forest around us was silent now. The only sound was the crunching of leaves under our boots and the occasional rustle of branches. The further we went into the woods, the more distant the crying became. It was as if the sound was floating on the breeze, never quite in the direction we expected it to be. I don't like this, I muttered, looking around. The trees were closing in on us, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers in the dim light. The flashlight seemed to barely make a dent in the darkness. Dad didn't respond, but I could see the muscles in his jaw tightening. He was just as unnerved as I was. I think he hoped, just like I did, that we would find a child wandering in the woods, maybe lost, maybe scared. But as we continued walking, my hopes started to fade. It wasn't right. The crying had stopped entirely now. I scanned the forest around us. The sound had moved so far away that I wasn't even sure we were heading in the right direction anymore. Maybe it had been an animal all along. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe it was just some bird or animal mimicking the sound of a crying child. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The air was thick with the kind of quiet that only happens when something's wrong. The stillness felt suffocating, like the forest was holding its breath. Dad, we should go back, I said, my voice low but insistent. He didn't answer first, but I saw him slowly nod. He wasn't about to admit he was just as freaked out as I was, but we both knew it was time to turn around. The air felt different now, colder, heavier. As we started to head back toward the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That's when we heard it again, the cry. This time, it was much closer. The sound pierced the night air, cutting through the silence. The cry was filled with such raw desperation that it sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't something that could be easily explained away. It was a child in pain, a child in fear. I swung the flashlight wildly, but the beam caught only the dark, empty forest. Dad, I said, my voice rising in panic. It's so close. It's right here. We both froze. I could hear my breath coming in short, fast gasps, but I was too scared to move. My heart was racing in my chest, pounding so loudly I thought it might give us away to whatever was out there. Then, from the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the flashlight beam, something caught my eye. A shadow. It was too small to be a person. Did you see that? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Dad turned, his eyes squinting. I saw something, he said, his voice tight. We need to go back now. Without another word, we turned and started walking quickly back to camp. The sound of the crying seemed to follow us, but it wasn't getting closer. It was just there, distant, yet present. When we finally broke through the trees and into the open, the campsite was exactly as we had left it. The fire was still flickering, casting long shadows on the ground. Kelly was sitting by the fire, her stuffed bear clutched tightly in her hands. Mom was standing nearby, looking nervously into the woods. I don't know how long we stood there, staring into the forest, but it felt like an eternity. "What was it?" Mom asked, her voice trembling. "We didn't find anything," Dad said, his voice strained. He didn't seem willing to tell her the truth about the shadow or the cry that had chilled us to our bones. We didn't talk much that night. We sat around the fire, the warmth offering some comfort, but it didn't do much to ease the unease gnawing at the back of my mind. The crying had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been watching us. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun was up, the birds were singing, and the woods around us looked peaceful, like nothing had happened. But I couldn't forget the sound of that crying or the shadow I had glimpsed in the dark. We packed up and left early, without any words about what had happened. We drove home in silence, and even now, years later, I still think about that night. The crying in the woods, the shadow. What was it? Who was it? To this day, I don't know. But I'm certain of one thing. Whatever it wasn't just an animal, and it wasn't just my imagination. It was something real, something that had been out there in the dark, waiting. The sun had barely begun to dip behind the trees as I made my way deeper into the forest. I've been hiking alone for the past 2 days, savoring the solitude, the crisp mountain air, and the stillness that seemed to cloak everything around me. My legs were tired, but it was that satisfying kind of tired, the kind that lets you know you've earned your rest. I'd planned to camp near a small creek I'd spotted on the map, but the further I hiked, the more I found myself moving off trail, looking for a spot that felt right. I didn't see much wildlife, just the occasional bird flitting through the canopy above, but the forest had an eerie quiet to it, almost as if something was just out of sight. The dense trees blocked most of the sunlight, and the shadows seemed to stretch out longer than they should have. I told myself I was just imagining it, and the idea of finding a perfect campsite kept me focused on the trail ahead. As I walked, I noticed the air had grown colder, heavier. The breeze that had been there earlier was now gone, and the silence around me deepened. My feet crunched over fallen leaves as I neared a clearing. That's when I saw it, a campsite, abandoned but recent. It was just off the trail, hidden from view, like whoever had been here didn't want to be found. At first, I thought it was just a group that had packed up early, leaving behind their things in a hurry. But as I stepped closer, something didn't sit right. There was a fire ring in the center, the last embers of a once bright fire still smoldering, sending up occasional wisps of smoke. It wasn't completely out yet, but it was close. The ashes were too fresh. No one had been gone for long. I looked around. There was a tent nearby, half collapsed, as if it had been abandoned mid-use. A sleeping bag lay inside, the zipper wide open. But it was the scattered clothing around the campfire that gave me a bad feeling. A jacket was draped over a log, shoes tossed haphazardly near a pack. The pack was open, its contents spilling out. A water bottle, a few bars of trail food, a map. Everything was left behind, as if someone had just walked away in the middle of whatever they were doing. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to keep walking. I was alone out here, miles from the nearest road, and something about this situation screamed wrong, but my curiosity got the better of me. I kneeled next to the fire ring and took a look at the ground around it. The dirt was disturbed, like something had been dragged. I stood up and took a few steps toward the tent, trying to get a better look at the site. It didn't make sense. Who would leave so abruptly? The fire was barely out, and nothing seemed to be in a state of disarray like a storm or a sudden event had caused them to flee. That's when I saw it. A knife. It was lying in the dirt near the fire ring, its blade glinting in the dying light of the day. I walked closer, heart pounding my chest, and knelt to examine it. The handle was plain, nothing special, but the blade was stained with something dark, unmistakably blood. It wasn't just a smear either. The blood had dried around the edge, and there was more of it on the ground beneath the knife, like it had been dropped hastily. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and a wave of unease swept over me. I'd read enough horror stories to know where this was going, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just an accident, some kind of hunting incident gone wrong. But the reality of the situation didn't help calm my nerves. I stood up quickly, my legs unsteady, and took one last look around. Whoever had been here wasn't coming back. I didn't wait around any longer. I grabbed my gear and hurried out of the clearing, trying to put distance between myself and that camp. My footsteps were heavy and rushed, but I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone emerging from the trees, someone who had been watching me the entire time. I found my way to a small ridge with a flat spot just big enough for my tent. I set up quickly, my hands shaking as I pounded the stakes into the ground. The light was quickly fading, and the cold of the night started to creep in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, so I tried to tell myself it was just the isolation getting to me. The sounds of the forest seemed louder now, as if the trees themselves were whispering. I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, trying to settle my mind. I ate a quick dinner, the food barely touching my stomach as my thoughts drifted back to the campsite. The bloodstained knife, the abandoned things, the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone out there. The night deepened, and the stars twinkled overhead, their cold light slipping through the gaps in the trees. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. It wasn't long before I heard something. At first, it was so faint I thought I was imagining it. But then it came again. Footsteps, light and deliberate, but there, circling my tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't an animal, not a bear or a deer. The steps were too rhythmic, too deliberate. My heart began to race. I strained to listen, praying it was just the wind, but the footsteps continued, slow and steady, making a loop around my tent. The sound of crunching leaves and twigs underfoot grew louder as whoever it was moved closer. I grabbed my flashlight, holding it tightly in my hand, the beam trembling as I pointed it toward the tent door. My mind raced through possibilities. Who could it be? Someone else camping out here? But who would be walking around at night, stalking the perimeter of my camp? It didn't make sense. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting for any sound, any movement. But there was nothing. A deep, suffocating silence filled the air. I dared not move, not even to breathe too loudly. If I was being watched, I didn't want to give myself away. Minutes passed, maybe more, before I finally summoned the courage to peek through the mesh of my tent, staring into the darkness. I couldn't see anything, not with the dim moonlight and the thick trees surrounding me. But I could feel it, the presence lurking just out of view. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, eyes wide open, listening for any sound, every little crack of a branch, every rustle of the wind in the leaves. The footsteps never came back, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning finally came, I wasted no time packing up my camp. I barely ate breakfast, my hands moving quickly and mechanically as I stuffed everything into my backpack. I couldn't leave fast enough. I made my way back to the trail, my mind spinning. Whoever had been at that campsite, whoever had left that knife, was out there somewhere in the same woods I was. I didn't know if they were still following me or if I had imagined the footsteps the night before, but I wasn't taking any chances. I needed to get out of there. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was fully up and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects. The world seemed ordinary again, normal. But I couldn't shake the image of that blood-stained knife and the abandoned campsite. I don't know who had been there before me or what had happened. I never found out. I try not to think about it too much, but I couldn't help myself. It had felt too real, too close to be just an odd coincidence. The one thing I knew for sure was this: I would never camp alone in those woods again. I had been hiking solo for a few days, deep into a remote trail that wound through dense forest and jagged hills. It wasn't the easiest route, but I liked it that way. There were no crowds, no noise from other hikers, just the sounds of the forest around me. The crunch of dry leaves underfoot, the rustling of tree branches overhead, and the occasional bird call breaking through the silence. It was peaceful. The weather had been nice all day, clear skies, a slight breeze keeping the temperature comfortable. I had my pack on, containing my water, some food, a few supplies for camping if I needed it, and of course my map. I've been walking for a while, well into the afternoon, following the worn path that snaked through thick woods. I knew this trail, but not all of it. I had read that it was less traveled, so I had hoped for some solitude. But as I hiked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It started subtly. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. I'd hear footsteps behind me, crunching twigs or the shuffle of dirt. But when I glanced back, I saw nothing. The trail had been quiet for a while, no other hikers passing by, and no signs of anyone being around. But after a few miles, the feeling didn't go away. I kept hearing it, the sound of footsteps, always there just behind me, never speeding up but never falling back either. I kept telling myself it was probably just another hiker, someone else enjoying the trail, but the longer I walked, the more the unease gnawed at me. The trail was narrow, winding through thick trees with no place to hide, just the occasional clearing where the forest thinned out for a bit. As I trudged on, my pace began to quicken, not from any physical exertion, but from a growing sense of discomfort. The sound of those footsteps behind me, always keeping the same distance, was beginning to get under my skin. The thing was, every time I looked back, I saw nothing. No one, no other hiker, just the trees, the trail, and that same feeling of being watched. Still, the sound was there. Every time I stepped, I could hear them behind me, matching my pace exactly. When I stopped to take a breath, they stopped too. When I started walking again, they followed. They never gained on me, but they didn't fall behind either. It was as if they were just waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. It didn't make sense. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just hiking at the same pace. Maybe they were just far enough behind that I couldn't see them when I looked back. But the longer I walked, the more I felt like something wasn't right. I tried a trick to test it. I decided to speed up. I pushed myself a little harder, picking up my pace, forcing myself into a faster rhythm to see if they would catch up. Sure enough, after a few minutes, I could still hear the footsteps behind me, keeping exactly in line with my movements. The same distance, no faster, no slower. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing but empty trail. I tried to slow down too, and the sound of the footsteps slowed with me. It was unnerving. Something wasn't right. I tried not to panic. I told myself it was probably just some other hiker, someone who was just as lost in their thoughts as I was, not really thinking about the fact they were following me. I decided to make a sharp turn off the main trail into a small patch of thick woods, hoping to lose them for a bit. Maybe see if I could get some clarity on who or what was following me. I didn't want to make it obvious that I was trying to shake them off, so I moved quickly but quietly, stepping off the main trail and ducking into a thicket of bushes and trees. It was a little tricky navigating through the underbrush, but I didn't care. I wanted to get away, and I wanted to do it fast. I kept moving, finding a small clearing where I crouched behind a large rock, hoping they wouldn't notice the detour. My heart was racing now, my mind spinning with 100 different possibilities. I listened carefully, hoping to hear them pass by, still walking the trail, unaware of my little diversion. I could hear the rustle of leaves, the sounds of a few birds calling out in the trees, but most of all, I heard the footsteps, slow at first, almost hesitant, and then they started to get closer. They were still on the trail. I crouched lower, holding my breath, trying to make myself as invisible as possible. The sound of their footsteps was unmistakable now. They were getting closer, moving deliberately, and I felt that deep, gut-wrenching fear starting to creep up again. I couldn't see them, but they were so close. I knew I had to stay hidden. If they passed by without noticing me, I could slip back onto the trail and keep going. If they saw me, I didn't know what I would do. I didn't know what kind of person would be out here, following me for so long, but it wasn't something I wanted to find out. I tried to steady my breathing, keeping still, barely moving a muscle. The footsteps grew louder, and then, finally, I saw them, just barely through the foliage. A figure appeared in the distance, walking the trail slowly, cautiously, as if scanning the woods around them. They were tall, wearing a dark jacket, and had a backpack slung over their shoulders. But there was something about them that made me uneasy. The way they moved, the way they kept glancing around, as though they were looking for something or someone. I held my breath. The figure was close now, only a few yards away, walking past my hiding spot, oblivious to me. I could see their face now, a man, probably in his 30s, with a scruffy beard and a tired look in his eyes. He wasn't looking at me, but he was scanning the woods. His eyes moved quickly, darting from tree to tree, and I couldn't help but feel the fear grip me even harder. He was still walking, but he was getting closer to my hiding place. I kept myself pressed flat against the ground, my chest tight with anxiety. I needed to stay quiet, stay still. My heart was pounding in my ears. I was terrified that one wrong move would make him realize I was here. He stopped just past my position. I could hear him breathe, slow and heavy, almost like he was listening too. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he kept walking, moving at a slow pace down the trail. I stayed frozen, my body aching with the need to move, but I couldn't. Not yet. I had to wait. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade into the distance. He didn't stop, didn't look back. Eventually, the sound of him walking faded completely, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I stayed hidden for another 5 minutes, just to make sure he was really gone. Once I was certain, I slowly stood up, my legs stiff and sore from crouching so long. I looked around, my mind racing. Had he been following me the whole time? Was he trying to find me? Or was it just a coincidence? I didn't know, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I took a deep breath and stepped back onto the trail. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I walked, but the tension in my body didn't go away. My pace was quick, but not frantic. I didn't look back. I kept moving forward, hoping to find some other hikers, maybe some sign of life, maybe someone who could help make sense of what had just happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about that man, the way he moved through the woods, as if he was hunting for something or someone. I didn't know if he had been following me intentionally or if it was all just a weird coincidence. Either way, I wasn't taking any chances. I kept walking, my eyes darting to every sound in the trees, my ears straining for any sign of someone behind me. But there was nothing, just the steady rhythm of my footsteps, the trail, and the deep silence of the forest. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the end of the trail. The familiar trailhead sign was a welcome sight, but my mind was still racing, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't see anyone at the parking lot, and that was fine by me. I just wanted to get out of there, away from the woods, away from whatever had been lurking in them. I didn't know if that man had been following me on purpose, or if he had been just another hiker. But I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I drove back to town, the sun setting behind me, and I never looked back. I had been hiking alone for hours, and the sun was just starting to set behind the ridgeline. The kind of sunset where the sky turns this deep orange, and the light cuts through the trees in sharp, elongated shadows. It had been a long day, and I was tired, but I didn't mind. The trail had been quiet, peaceful even, with just the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves as a breeze stirred the forest. I was heading back to camp, ready to get a fire going and settle in for the night. My campsite was only about a mile away, and I knew I had enough time before it got dark. I didn't mind hiking at night, but I preferred to get back before I couldn't see the trail anymore. The last thing I wanted was to end up tripping over roots or rocks in the dark. But then, as I walked, I noticed something strange. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a faint flicker of light. It wasn't the usual light from the setting sun, and it definitely wasn't a flashlight. It wasn't like any light I'd ever seen before, not out here. My first thought was that it was another camper, maybe someone who had set up camp in a more remote part of the woods. But that didn't make sense because there were no other campsites around here. Just a few other hikers scattered miles away, or so I thought. I stopped for a moment and squinted at the light, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It flickered again, almost like a lantern swinging back and forth in a breeze, but there was no breeze. The light didn't seem to have any shape, no real source, just a soft glow. It seemed out of place in the growing darkness. It didn't feel right. Curiosity got the best of me, and I started walking toward it. My pack felt heavier than usual, like it was pressing down on me, but I pushed through. It's just another camper, I thought. Maybe they got lost, or maybe they're out there fishing, or just setting up for the night. Whatever it was, I figured I could help if they needed it. But as I walked closer, something in my gut began to twist, an unease that I couldn't shake. The closer I got, the stranger the light looked. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But no, the light was too steady, too consistent, swaying gently as if it were being held in midair. I glanced around, trying to spot any movement, any sign of a person, but there was nothing. No footprints, no sounds, no rustling of bushes or trees. Just the light, swaying slowly like a lantern hanging from some invisible string. I took another step forward, my boots crunching on the gravel. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet of the forest. With each step, the light seemed to hover a little further ahead, always just out of reach. The more I walked, the less it felt like the light was coming from the ground. It was like it was suspended above it, hovering just above the brush, swaying back and forth in a rhythmic motion, but with no visible person or hand to hold it. A sudden chill ran through me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stopped. Something was off. This wasn't normal. Lanterns don't float in the air by themselves. They don't sway like that without anyone near them. I should have turned back then. I should have trusted my gut. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I needed to understand, something I needed to figure out. I started walking faster, drawn to the strange, flickering light, even though every part of my body was telling me to turn around. The silence in the forest around me was suffocating. The birds had stopped chirping, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. As I got closer, I saw that the light was no longer flickering in the way a lantern would. It had changed. The glow was more erratic now, almost as if it were breathing, pulsing in and out with a rhythm I couldn't understand. It wasn't the soft, warm light of a lantern anymore. It was colder, like it was pulling the warmth from the air, and that made my skin crawl. I took another step, and that's when I saw it more clearly. The light was coming from a lantern, sure, but not a regular one. It was suspended about 4 feet off the ground, swaying slowly like a pendulum. There were no wires, no ropes, nothing holding it up. Just this eerie, cold glow hanging in the air. My heart was pounding now, thudding so loudly that it was all I could hear. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. A pressure, like the world was holding its breath. I wanted to run. Every instinct in me screamed to run back to camp, to leave this bizarre sight behind and forget I ever saw it. But I didn't. I stepped closer, too close, closer than I should have. The light continued to sway, as if it were waiting for me to get just a little bit nearer. My eyes couldn't leave it. It was like it was pulling me in, drawing me to it with some unseen force. Suddenly, the lantern jerked violently to one side, as if someone had yanked it. I froze in place, my eyes locked on it. The light flickered again, but this time it didn't return to its slow, gentle swaying. Instead, it swung wildly in the air, faster and faster, almost as if it was in a frenzy. I could feel the air around me grow colder, a biting chill that made my breath freeze in the air. My stomach turned. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, unwilling to move. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the flickering light, but eventually something snapped inside me. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and bolted, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was back in my campsite, gasping for breath, my legs shaking beneath me. My campfire flickered in the dark, and I collapsed beside it, still feeling the weight of that strange, cold light in the pit of my stomach. It took me a long time to calm down, to convince myself that I was safe, but I couldn't shake the image of that lantern, swinging alone in the air. No person, no string, no explanation. I tried to tell myself it was some trick of the light, something natural I just couldn't explain, but I knew deep down that what I saw wasn't normal. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion, or maybe I stumbled across something that defied logic. But one thing I knew for sure, I would never go near that spot again. Something about it, that light, felt wrong. Something about it felt like it was waiting for me to get too close. And next time, I wasn't sure I'd make it back. I had been looking forward to the camping trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a solo trip, a chance for some peace and quiet in the wild, away from the noise of everyday life. I chose a remote spot deep in the woods, far from any roads or trails. No one else was around, just me, my tent, and the quiet of nature. I set up camp, built a fire, and spent the afternoon reading and enjoying the solitude. The air was crisp, the sun set early, and the nightfall brought with it an eerie silence that I found oddly comforting. I felt alone, but not in a bad way. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and a few crackers, washed it down with a bottle of water, and by the time it was fully dark, I was ready to crawl into my tent. The night was still, the trees around me barely rustling in the light breeze. I had a small fire burning, but it was contained in a fire pit, so I knew the risk of it getting out of hand was minimal. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it up, and lay back, staring at the ceiling of the tent. The silence was overwhelming. The first few hours of the night were uneventful. I kept waking up every so often, not because I was uncomfortable, but because the stillness was so unnatural. No sounds of distant animals, no chirping crickets, just pure quiet. I kept thinking that at any moment, some noise would break the silence. But it didn't. Everything stayed dead still, and I eventually fell into a deep sleep. At least I thought it was deep. I was awakened abruptly by a noise, something outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind. Maybe it was a branch hitting the side of the tent or the rustling of leaves. But then, there was a heavy thud, the kind of thud that shook the ground beneath me. I froze, holding my breath, listening. It came again, closer this time. Another heavy thud. Then came a sound I could barely make out, but it sent a chill through me. The sound of claws scraping against the ground. Long, sharp claws like the kind a bear would have. My heart jumped into my throat. I had heard about bears in this area. The rangers had warned me to store my food in the bear-proof locker, to keep everything sealed up tight. But I hadn't expected anything like this, something so close. Something that might be interested in my tent. I stayed perfectly still, willing myself to calm down. I kept telling myself that if I stayed quiet, if I didn't panic, it would leave. It had to leave. The scraping sound came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the sound of claws against dirt. It was the sound of claws scraping against the fabric of the tent. My tent. I could hear the bear moving around, circling, sniffing the air. I had never felt so small in my life. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel my pulse racing, my breath shallow. The bear was so close now. I could hear it snorting, its breath thick and heavy as it sniffed at the ground around me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I knew both were terrible ideas. The best I could do was stay perfectly still and hope that whatever was out there would lose interest. But with every sound, every scraping claw, every sniff, I felt more trapped. The tent was thin. It wouldn't take much for a bear to tear through it. I tried to remind myself that bears usually weren't interested in humans, but that didn't help. Not right now. I shifted slightly in my sleeping bag, trying to get into a position where I could reach my bear spray, which I had placed by the side of the tent, just in case. The bear had no idea I was there. It couldn't see me. I could only see shadows through the fabric of the tent, and the darker the night got, the more surreal everything felt. I slowly moved my hand toward the spray, careful not to make sound. The bear continued to circle the tent, dragging its claws along the ground. It felt like hours, though I knew it hadn't been that long. The noise was maddening. The thudding of its footsteps and the grating sound of its claws were all I could hear. My entire body was tense. I didn't dare even breathe too loudly. Every muscle in my body felt like it was ready to snap. Then the worst possible thing happened. The bear let out a low growl. It wasn't loud at first, just a soft rumble. But I could hear the threat in it, and my heart skipped a beat. It was too close. I knew bears didn't usually attack unless provoked, but I also knew that a hungry bear or one that felt cornered could be unpredictable. I wasn't sure which one I was dealing with right now, and that thought terrified me more than anything else. I held my breath again, trying to remain as calm as possible. I needed to think. I needed to wait. If I panicked, I might make a noise that would provoke the bear. I reminded myself to keep still, to stay calm. But the growl came again, louder this time, followed by another round of sniffing. I realized then that the bear wasn't just curious. It wasn't just sniffing around for food. It was close, too close. I could feel its presence through the tent fabric. It could probably smell my fear and maybe even sense that I was trapped inside. I reached for the bear spray again, my hand shaking uncontrollably as I fumbled for the canister. The silence around me felt so thick, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I had no idea how much longer I could lie here, pretending to be just another part of the forest. The bear was still circling, still growling, still clawing at the ground. Every noise made me flinch. Then, as quickly as it had started, the bear's movement stopped. Everything went still. I was left in complete silence, and my heart pounded in my ears, so loud it drowned out everything else. Was it leaving? Had it gotten bored and wandered off? I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. I just waited. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually I heard the faintest rustle. Then nothing. The bear was gone. For what felt like an eternity, I didn't move. I just stayed there, frozen, listening to the night air, hoping the bear was truly gone. It took everything I had not to jump up and run outside to check. But I knew better than that. I had to be sure. So I stayed there in the dark, waiting for some sign that it was safe. Finally, after what felt like hours, I slowly and carefully reached for the zipper of the tent. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely grip it, but I managed to pull it open just a crack. I waited again, listening. The forest was quiet now, too quiet. I took a deep breath and pushed the zipper open all the way, poking my head out cautiously. I didn't see the bear. I didn't hear it. The ground was still. The air was still. Everything was still. I waited for a long time before I finally dared to step outside. My legs were shaky, and my heart was still racing, but the bear was gone. I felt a mix of relief and disbelief. I stood there under the open sky, looking around in the pale light of the moon. There were no signs of the bear's presence anymore. No tracks, no broken branches, no signs of destruction. The only thing I could hear now were the faint sounds of night insects and the wind rustling through the trees. I had narrowly avoided a disaster, but I wasn't going to let my guard down. I spent the rest of the night by the fire, keeping the flames high and staying alert. I wasn't about to let my luck run out. In the morning, I packed up quickly. I didn't want to stay another minute. I had come out here to escape, but after that night, I knew I couldn't take the risk of staying in the woods alone again, not with the real dangers that live there. As I packed up my gear and began my hike back to civilization, I kept thinking about that bear. It had been so close, so real, and I knew it wasn't a fluke. I had survived, but it had been far too close for comfort. And that's when I realized nature isn't just beautiful, it's dangerous. We were deep in the Smoky Mountains, the kind of place where the air smells thick with pine and wet earth, the trees towering above us, reaching for the sky like giant, ancient hands. The trail we were on was rugged, winding, and damp with the remnants of an early morning fog. It was my third day on the hike with the group, a mix of seasoned hikers and a few who were out for their first real adventure. We'd been moving at a steady pace, laughing and chatting as we passed around snacks and the occasional water bottle, the chatter echoing off the trees. I remember the air had that sharp coolness to it, the kind that bites into your lungs when you take a deep breath. The trail curved ahead, and the sounds of the forest mixed with the rhythmic shuffle of our boots on the dirt path. Birds fluttered between the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of water, maybe a creek or stream cutting its way through the mountain. We'd just come around a bend when I heard it. Clear as day. A voice. It wasn't a whisper, but not a shout either. Just a regular voice, normal, like someone calling to me. It was soft, yet it cut through the noise of the forest. I froze. It was my name, unmistakably. Hey, hey, the voice said, right from the woods to my left. It didn't sound urgent or panicked, but it was definitely there, calling me. I stopped looking around. The others in the group were a few paces ahead, and none of them seemed to notice. They kept moving, talking amongst themselves. I looked back toward the woods. My heart started to pick up speed. The voice was still in my head, the words echoing. I swear I heard again, but this time a little more urgently, like someone was trying to get my attention, like they were calling from just out of sight. It was unsettling. I stepped off the trail, my boots crunching against the underbrush. I wasn't sure why I did it, but something about that voice tugged at me, pulling me to investigate. The woods ahead were thick, the trees were packed close together, and the canopy above blocked out most of the sky. The ground was soft, and with every step, I could hear the small crack of twigs breaking underfoot. The further I went, the stranger the feeling became. It wasn't just the voice anymore, it was the silence around me. It was dead quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. The air felt still, heavier somehow, like the world was holding its breath. I kept going, drawn to the spot where I thought the voice had come from. But when I reached a small clearing, it was just trees. Nothing. The same deep green shadows, the same old growth, nothing to explain the voice. I stood there, scanning the area, my skin prickling as the silence wrapped itself around me. The voice had stopped. I glanced back toward the trail. I should have turned around right then. I should have walked back to my group, told them I just spaced out or heard something weird in the wind. But no, I kept looking, scanning every corner of the woods. My mind was racing. I was trying to make sense of it. Was it one of the others, playing some kind of joke? No, it couldn't have been. The voice was too real, too clear. Then I heard it again. This time, it was more frantic, like someone in distress. Hey, hey! I froze, my stomach twisting with a deep, gnawing unease. The voice sounded closer now, just beyond the trees. The tone shifted. There was something urgent in it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But still, there was no movement around me, no sign of anyone. I took a few steps forward, instinctively wanting to help, to find out who was calling. But as soon as I moved deeper, the voice cut off. Complete silence again. I stood there, tense and listening. Nothing. I felt like I was being watched, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. But nothing came. No more voices. No signs of movement. The woods had returned to their natural stillness. I turned around, deciding to head back. I took a few steps toward the trail, looking over my shoulder one last time. But the voice didn't come again. My heart still pounded in my chest, and there was this gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach, but I tried to shake it off as nerves, maybe even just fatigue messing with my mind. When I stepped back onto the trail, I was ready to call out to the group. I expected them to be right there, but they weren't. The trail was empty. I froze again, this time with a rush of panic flooding my veins. I looked ahead, then behind me. They were gone. The path was empty, no sign of anyone, not even their footsteps in the dirt. How could they have gone so far without me noticing? I started walking fast, looking down the trail, calling their names under my breath. Maybe they just kept walking ahead, but surely I would have seen them. The trees hadn't been that thick. They couldn't have just vanished. I turned the next bend, but there was still no one. I kept walking, faster now, calling out louder, my voice breaking through the stillness of the woods. The air was heavy and thick with an almost suffocating silence. It wasn't normal. Something felt off. I rounded another corner, and that's when I saw them. All of them. They were sitting down on the side of the trail, looking at me like I just emerged from the woods as if they had never been ahead of me. None of them looked surprised. They didn't seem to care, like there was nothing strange about me walking up to them from behind. "Where did you guys go?" I asked, my voice sharp with a mixture of confusion and panic. They just stared at me. "We've been here the whole time," one of them said slowly, their voice calm, like nothing was wrong. My heart sank. I looked around, scanning the group's faces. I wanted to believe them, but something was wrong. Something didn't add up. I took a few steps back, trying to steady my breath, still feeling the weight of what I just experienced. The voice, the emptiness, the sudden disappearance of the group. It wasn't just a lapse in attention or a simple mistake. I knew that much. One of the hikers noticed my expression and stood up, walking over to me. "Are you okay?" they asked, their voice gentle but tinged with concern. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat. I heard something. Someone called my name from the woods. They looked at me for a long moment, their eyes narrowing slightly. What do you mean? Are you sure it wasn't just a trick of the wind or the trees? I shook my head. No, it was clear. Someone was calling me. There was a long silence, and then the person nodded slowly, but I could see the hesitation in their eyes. They didn't say anything else, but the unease settled between us. It felt like the forest itself was watching, waiting. The rest of the group began to stand up, brushing dirt off their pants, acting like everything was normal, like we hadn't just been through something strange. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air around us felt different, as if the woods had shifted somehow, becoming more distant, colder, less inviting. We didn't speak much as we continued on the trail, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. About the voice, about how it had called my name, so clearly, so urgently, only to leave me with nothing. And as the rest of the hike continued, I couldn't help but feel like I was being followed. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot felt like someone was right behind me, watching, waiting. But every time I turned, there was nothing there. We made camp that night, set up our tents under the fading light of dusk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt different now, closed in, pressing in on me as if they were holding their breath, waiting for something. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound in the darkness set my nerves on edge. I kept hearing things like branches snapping in the distance or the faintest rustle of leaves. My mind kept drifting back to the voice that had called me, the voice that still haunted me, even in the safety of the campfire's glow. And that's when I realized something. No matter how far we hiked, no matter how much ground we covered, I had no idea if I had ever really been alone. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months, eager to escape the noise of the world and spend some quiet time in the wilderness. The remote national park I chose was tucked deep into the mountains, far away from roads and towns. No one would bother me here. I had my gear all set and was looking forward to the solitude. Just me, my tent, and the forest. I arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the ground. I set up my tent beside a small creek, the sound of water flowing over rocks soothing me. I had a small campfire going, and I spent a few hours reading and enjoying the peace. There was no one else in sight, no hikers or campers around. It was the kind of quiet you only get when you're far away from civilization. As night settled in, I put out the fire, bundled up in my sleeping bag, and zipped the tent closed. I didn't want to leave the warmth of my sleeping bag, but the cold night air was beginning to settle in. The only light was the soft glow of my flashlight, which I had left outside, just in case I needed it later. The forest at night was different. The sounds I was used to during the day, birds, rustling leaves, the occasional animal, were replaced by the eerie silence of the night. Even the water in the creek seemed quieter now, like it had slowed down as the world around me rested. My mind started to wander, thinking about the solitude, the beauty of the place, the isolation. It wasn't until I heard the first sound that my nerves began to tighten. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, footsteps, soft but steady, like someone walking slowly through the forest. I thought it was another camper, maybe a late-night hiker who had gotten lost or was taking a stroll through the woods. But something fell off. The footsteps were too slow, too deliberate. They didn't sound like someone just walking casually. I strained my ears, trying to focus. The steps were coming closer. I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, thinking maybe I could help someone who had gotten lost. "Hello," I said, my words almost swallowed by the thick night air. I waited, listening for any response. Nothing. The footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming closer, each step sending a small shiver down my spine. My heart started a race, and I suddenly wished I had kept the fire going. I stayed still, my breath shallow. The footsteps were close now. Too close. Whoever was out, there was just beyond the reach of the glow from my flashlight. I couldn't see anything through the thin fabric of my tent, but I could hear the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was out there, walking around my tent. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I didn't know if I should call out again, or if I should stay quiet, hoping they would just go away. Then it happened. I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, too clear, as if it were right outside my tent. "Get out of here." The words were slow, almost like a warning. They sent a chill through me, freezing me in place. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who would be out there, and why would they say something like that? My flashlight, the one I had left outside, was still lying on the ground. I could see the faint outline of it through the thin fabric of my tent, just a few feet away. The voice had come from the direction of the creek, but I couldn't make out any details. I wanted to reach for the flashlight, to grab it and shine it out of the tent, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The air felt thick, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I lay there, absolutely still, listening to the forest around me. The footsteps had stopped. The silence that followed felt suffocating. My thoughts raced. Maybe it was just a prank, some other camper messing with me. But then again, the voice sounded so real, so close. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid, but the tension in my body wouldn't let me relax. I didn't know how much time passed. Seconds? Minutes? I couldn't tell. But then I heard again. Footsteps. This time, they were moving around my tent. I couldn't see anything outside, but I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, the slight rustling of branches being disturbed. Whoever was out, they were circling my tent. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't notice that I was still awake. Every muscle in my body was tense, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to scream out, to ask who they were, but I couldn't bring myself to say a word. What if they were dangerous? What if it wasn't just some lost camper? The thought of someone out there, watching me, made my stomach twist with dread. Then, something changed. I felt a pressure on the tent, a slight shift, as though someone had leaned against it. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through me. The fabric of the tent was thin, and I could feel the slightest movement as if someone was pressing against it. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? No, the weight was too deliberate, too human. My eyes darted around inside the tent, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. My pocket knife was in my bag, but it felt miles away. The only thing I could reach was the flashlight, and I wasn't sure if that would help. The voice came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the same cold tone, the warning from before. This time, it was more like a command. Leave. The word was dragged out, almost a hiss, like it was being whispered through gritted teeth. I didn't know what to do. My mind screamed at me to get out of the tent, to run. But I couldn't move. My body wouldn't respond. My instincts were telling me to stay hidden, to stay quiet, to not give away that I was still inside. I was trapped in the darkness, with no way of knowing who or what was outside. For what felt like an eternity, the footsteps continued to circle. Sometimes they would stop, and I would strain to listen, hoping they would leave. But they didn't. The tension in my body was unbearable. I had no idea who this person was or what they wanted, but the more I listened, the more I was convinced that they were waiting for something. Waiting for me to make a move. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. I waited, holding my breath, hoping that whatever it was would just leave. But it didn't. Instead, I heard a soft shuffle, like someone was kneeling down next to the tent. I couldn't help myself anymore. I had to do something. I reached for the flashlight, my hand trembling as I fumbled for it. I didn't know if I could shine it outside without being seen, but I couldn't stay in the dark any longer. The beam of light cut through the night, shining on the ground just outside my tent. At first, I saw nothing. No person, no figure. Just the empty ground and the faint glow of the creek in the distance. I breathed a sigh of relief, but that relief was short-lived. The light from the flashlight illuminated something on the ground, something I hadn't noticed before. A footprint, a fresh print, right beside the tent, just outside the fabric. I froze again, my blood running cold. The print was clear, with deep impressions of a boot in the soft earth. It was too close, too fresh. Whoever had been walking around my tent was right there. Without thinking, I grabbed my knife and crawled to the far side of the tent, away from the entrance. I had no plan, no real idea of what I would do if someone came inside, but I had to be ready. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. I didn't hear anything for a while. The silence was maddening. I had no idea if the person was still out there, watching, waiting. I couldn't bring myself to leave the tent, not with that footprint so close. Then, without warning, I heard a car in the distance. The sound of an engine, faint but unmistakable. It grew louder, and I could feel the tension in my body start to ease. The car passed by the campground, its headlights sweeping over the area. I quickly grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the road, hoping to see someone, anyone. I heard the engine slow, and then the car came to a stop. The sound of a door opening followed, and I heard voices from people who had finally arrived. My pulse raced as I waited, listening to the footsteps of the new arrivals. The voices grew louder, and then one of them called out, "Hey, is anyone here?" I scrambled to unzip the tent, throwing it open to reveal a couple of backpackers standing just outside. The man looked at me with concern. "We heard someone shouting. You okay?" I nodded, trying to catch my breath. "Yeah," I managed to say, my voice shaky. I thought someone was out here." The woman glanced around nervously. "We've been hiking for hours. We didn't see anyone else, just the road sign saying this site was taken." I stood there, staring at the trees, trying to make sense of everything. The footsteps, the voice, the prints. It was clear now that I wasn't alone, but I wasn't sure if it was the people from the car or something else that had been lurking nearby. After a few moments, the couple decided to camp nearby, and I was left in the silence of the night once again. But this time, the fear had subsided a little. My mind started to piece together what had happened. Someone had been out there, but who? Was it a prank? Or had something else been going on? I'll never know for sure, but I do know this. That night in the woods changed something in me. I'll never camp alone in such a remote